Good afternoon. I wanted to stop by here to tell my story. I know that this channel is dedicated exclusively, or at least almost exclusively, to stories of trailers, which is why it seemed to me the ideal place to tell what happened to me a few years ago. I am a woman and a trucker, one of the few who are dedicated to this profession. However, I have always had very kind male colleagues who never made me feel uncomfortable, for which I feel quite grateful. Many things have happened to me over these years, many of which can be considered paranormal, such as seeing shadows on dangerous curves that then disappear, hearing murmurs that seem to be brought by the wind, and even once seeing a couple of lights in the sky that made strange figures at an impossible speed. However, the most extraordinary event, and the one I am going to relate now, happened in 2020. I was transporting a load to Monterey when on the way, the engines suddenly failed, started making strange noises, and then stopped completely. Know something about mechanics, so I stopped to try to fix it. But I soon learned that the engine had considerable damage, and I did not have the tools or spare parts to start it again. So, I called the base, where I explained what happened. Since the cargo was a priority, they told me they would send another truck to complete the journey in the shortest possible time. Half an hour later, the replacement truck arrived. It was a very old vehicle. I realized that as soon as I saw it, its body was rusty, and its tires looked pretty worn. However, the engine was running very well, and that was what mattered. The truck driver got out and helped me couple the trailer back onto the truck. Once this was done, I got into the replacement truck and started what was left of the trip. I realized right away that the engine of that truck was making a hellish noise, smelled of dust and sweat, and rattled as if I were on top of an agricultural tractor. But what caught my attention the most was its radio. It was one of those old devices embedded in the dashboard, widely used during the 80s. When someone receives a call, a red light comes on. Then, you remove the microphone from the base and start speaking through it. I don't know why, but there was something about that radio that gave me chills. It wasn't so much its age, but that it crackled all the time, as if tuning into some kind of static. I tried moving it and cleaning the contacts, but nothing worked. I finally gave up and decided to ignore the noises. However, a few minutes later, something else was heard. It sounded like a scream. Terrified, I jacked up the engine and asked if there was anyone who needed help. In response, I got new screams, and this time they were quite chilling. It was noticeable that the person emitting them was very desperate or a victim of great pain. Those screams continued for at least 2 or 3 minutes, during which I could only listen, horrified, without knowing what to do. Then another loud noise was heard, and the communication was interrupted. I immediately contacted the base. The company's secretary answered and asked me what was happening. I told her what I had just heard, but, strangely, she said, I didn't hear anything on any of our frequencies. Maybe that radio is too old and is tuning frequencies from other places, so don't pay attention to it. I thanked her and cut the communication, then continued driving the truck alone. There were about 60 kilometers left to go, and after a while, the radio crackled again, and new voices were heard. This time, it was a man and a woman who seemed to be arguing. I raised the volume of the radio to listen better. I could distinguish that the man was called Carlos and the woman Aldana. Both were arguing because, apparently, Carlos had cheated on Aldana with another woman. The screams became more and more intense, and the fight grew more violent as the minutes passed. Then a noise was heard, like a blow, and Aldana screamed in pain, saying, "Please, stop." Those screams and blows continued to be heard while she pleaded for mercy. Finally, as with the previous communication, another noise, more powerful than the previous ones, was heard, and then everything fell silent. I remained quiet for a long time and finally concluded, horrified, that what I had just heard was a shot. I couldn't stand it any longer, so after a few minutes, I decided to call the police. I told them what I had heard and said that I thought I had captured a conversation between a couple consisting of a man named Carlos and a woman named Aldana, that they had had an argument, and that I thought it had ended tragically, meaning someone had shot and killed the other. The police listened to me attentively and asked if I had more information about the couple, their location, or at least the last name of one of them, as it would be very difficult to investigate otherwise. I realized it was useless to file a complaint, so I gave up, thanked the police, and cut off the call. Everything about the radio worried me. It gave me a bad feeling. There was something evil in that device, something that made me feel chills just by looking at it. Then, in a fit of extreme fear, I decided to turn it off. But to my surprise, shortly after, the device began to crackle again. I saw that the red power light was illuminated again, even though I had turned it off. I turned the device off again, and this time unplugged it. After a while, I heard its chilling crackle again, and now I had no doubt that I was facing something sinister and supernatural, something that exceeded my capacity for understanding. Again, new voices were heard. This time, it was a man who was crying. He seemed to be speaking to himself, repeating over and over that he was a failure, that everything bad happening to him was his fault, and that he didn't deserve to continue living. While saying all this, he cried inconsolably. Then there was a silence. Finally, this man said goodbye loudly, and another loud bang was heard. There was no doubt it was a shot, and then silence. I felt chills in every inch of my skin. I was dismayed because I had felt that man's anguish and at the same time, terrible helplessness for not being able to do anything. I had tried to talk to him, but it seemed he wasn't listening to me, perhaps because he was only paying attention to his pain. I knew that radio broadcasts quite miserable human events, perhaps happening miles away. I didn't understand why it only captured bad and terrible events, something I couldn't explain and deeply regretted. There was less and less time left to reach the destination, and I thought I would feel great relief when I delivered the load and got rid of that truck. Then I had the idea of calling the truck driver who had delivered the truck to me. He answered immediately and seemed quite surprised, asking if the new truck had also broken down. I told him no, that everything was working quite well. However, I asked him if he had perceived anything strange with the radio. Surprised, he said, "Well, no, really, no. I heard a little static, but it didn't seem strange because, after all, the radio is quite old." I thanked him, and we said goodbye. So, for some reason, only I could hear the calls on that radio. Thinking about this, an even more terrifying idea came to me. What if I was imagining it all? I was meditating on these questions when a new audio came through the radio. This time, it was a woman who seemed very terrified and was crying softly. I asked her what her name was, and I was surprised to hear her voice say, "Maricel." At that moment, I repeated, asking if she could hear me, and she said, "Yes, I can hear you. Please, I need your help." I told her to tell me what I could do for her, asked where she was and what was happening. but she answered that she didn't know exactly where she was. It was a kind of cabin, and she was locked in. I asked who had locked her in there, and she said she thought it was a man she had met the previous night at a party. They danced and chatted, and he seemed quite friendly and attentive. Afterward, he invited her for a drink, and she took it. It had a strange taste, but she didn't pay attention. Then he offered to take her home, and that was the last thing she remembered, because she woke up in a cabin with all the doors locked and windows barred, surrounded by trees. She told me that he had visited her once there, and that she asked him why he had her locked up, but he didn't answer. He just started humming a song. She was quite scared because, at that moment, she realized that he wasn't the kind man she had met at the party. She asked him to let her out, but he shook his head and closed the door again. She thought he was going to do very bad things to her and was terrified. I told her not to worry, that we would get through this. I said I'd cut the call for a moment to contact the police, but she refused, saying, "Please, don't leave me alone." I realized she was right. If I hung up, the call might be lost forever. This gave me a new idea. I insisted on asking where she was calling from, but she didn't know. Then she said something surprising. She felt like she was hallucinating, because the voice she heard from me wasn't coming through any radio or phone. She heard my voice from somewhere in the room, but didn't know how we were communicating. That's when I understood everything. Maybe this old radio picked up the voices of people under great anguish. At first, I thought it was a nightmare, but now I saw that I had the possibility to help someone. At that moment, I asked Maricel if she could see anything important outside the windows. Something other than trees, something that might give a clue as to where she was. She said, "Now that you mention it, I think there's a road about 5 kilometers ahead." She could see some cars passing by in the distance, though not many, only every few minutes or so. This information was important. It meant the cabin was on a little traveled road. So, I asked where the party had been where she met the man. She mentioned a well-known nightclub in Mexico City. I thought we were making pretty good progress, and I began to think I could help this poor woman. I asked if her friends had seen her with the man, and she said no, she had gone to the place alone, not knowing anyone, just wanting to have a few drinks. I asked if the guy had told her his name, and she said yes, his name was Marcos. Although, of course, it was possible that was a fake name. I asked her to describe everything about the man, his height, skin color, hair, anything she could remember that would be useful to pass on to the police. She described him as a tall man with wavy hair, a blonde goatee and pale blue eyes. Something that stood out was that he had a gold tooth. I was surprised and asked if she was sure, as this would be a very important detail. She confirmed, saying at first she didn't care much for it, but his personality captivated her. He was knowledgeable, his conversations were interesting, and he was quite funny at least. That was the mask he showed to lower her guard. I told her that, with all this information, it was enough, and I was heading to the nearest police station. I wasn't lying. I had already detoured a couple of minutes earlier to find a path to the police. She thanked me faintly and said she was scared but would hold on until I arrived. Then something occurred to me. If there was anything inside the cabin that could indicate where she was, photos, books, a map, anything would do. But, to my regret, she said the cabin was completely empty, with only a filthy mattress where she woke up and a deer antler hanging on one of the walls. I told her that was fine. All this information might be enough for the police. Suddenly, she said, "Wait." I asked what was happening, and she said the man was arriving because she could hear the engine of his car. She looked out the window to check and saw him carrying a large machete. At that moment, she started to cry and asked for help. I told Maricel to calm down and that she should defend herself no matter what, that I was about to reach the police. But after that, a loud slam was heard. Then a scream. It was the man's voice, shouting something, and Maricel's voice pleading for her life. I screamed her name, fearing the worst, but I didn't receive an answer. After a while, the silence that invaded the communication filled me with dark forebodings. Maricel, Maricel, are you there? Please answer, I said, over and over, but she never responded, and the communication finally cut off. I had to stop on the side of the road. My hands were trembling with helplessness, and I began to cry. I had lived through the last moments of a woman who had been kidnapped. I didn't know Maricel personally, but the rawness of her screams and pain had reached me through the radio. In an impulse of rage and pain, I ripped the radio off the dashboard and threw it out the window with great fury. Then I started the engine again and continued my way to the police station. Even though I assumed the worst for her, I decided I could do something with all the information she had given me. Maybe they could still catch that bastard. When I arrived at the police station, an officer attended to me and was deeply interested in my case. I told him everything Maricel had told me. The details of the man who had kidnapped her, his physical description, and his gold tooth, giving every detail I remembered. After they took my statement, the officer observed me carefully and told me to wait a minute. He left the office, leaving me alone for a while, and then came back with another officer. They made me repeat my story, and I told it as I remembered. This other man, who was a little older than the previous one, leaned toward me, examined me severely, and said, "You seem like a pretty honest girl, and I don't think you're lying." I answered, somewhat offended, that everything I told was true. Why would I lie in a case like this? Then he revealed something that left me completely shocked. "All this you're describing is a crime that occurred in 2011. I investigated it myself. Maricel Rodriguez, that was her full name, met a man named Ezequiel Aquiza in a nightclub in Mexico City, the same club you named. Ezequiel gave her a dose of burundanga in her drink, put her to sleep, and then took her to his cabin in the woods, where he murdered her with blows. Ezequiel was a man, just as you have described him, tall, blonde, with a beard, padlock, and, most importantly, a gold tooth. His cabin in the woods had an even deer hanging on the walls. We did not find it through the videos from the nightclubs, security cameras. When we caught him, it was already too late. Ezequiel had murdered Maricel and buried her in a place behind the woods, and he is currently serving a life sentence in the prison of Hidalgo. And I hope that this is how it ends, and he rots in that hole. After hearing the officer's words, I couldn't help but want to cry. I thought about Maricel and the fear she had transmitted through her voice. I imagined her in her last hours inside the cabin, locked up and unable to do anything. Nothing, with a terrible fear invaded the body. Finally, that beast, that man who had murdered her, the one who had entered the cabin with an axe in his hand, Maricel's fear, her desperate attempt to defend herself, and finally her sad death. I was left with the consolation of knowing that the murderer had been caught. I left the police station a few minutes later, and I resumed my way through the road. So I arrived at the company some time later. I delivered the cargo with quite a few delays, but they did not say anything because they knew about the incident with the truck. When I returned to the transport company, they asked about the radio and saw that it had been ripped from the dashboard, broken. I only claimed that it had malfunctions and that, in an attempt to make it work, I hit it, and finally I removed it from the board. This explanation, without a doubt, did not convince my bosses, who days later decided to fire me from the company. I didn't regret it. In fact, I felt relief because I knew I would never sit down again on board that truck that brought back so many sad memories. I currently work for another company, and I am quite happy, but every time I use the radio, I remember that experience, and a feeling of terrible unhappiness invades me, so to the point that I fervently wish that everything I went through was nothing more than a bad dream. How are you, listeners? I hope you have enjoyed the previous story. Very well, now let's move on to the next story. Good afternoon, my name is Roberto. I'm going to tell you my story. It happened a few months ago on a dark highway in the state of Durango, Mexico. Night had fallen, and I hadn't finished with the deliveries yet. I have a truck dedicated to dairy delivery. I had accelerated the truck to arrive on time, even though I didn't want to risk a lot. The night was very dark. I could barely see the marks on the road. At that time, I had problems with the headlights because the battery was low. The lights were blinking, and it was very difficult to see beyond 10 or 15 meters. Suddenly, I heard something make a noise, and the truck shook. At that moment, I knew it had burst a tire. Cursing for that mishap, I stopped the truck to one side of the road and took out the flashlight, examined the red tire, and knew that it was not possible to keep moving forward. So I had to change it if I wanted to get there on time. So I went to get the tools in the back of the box, and then I saw it. My eyes found something flashing among the branches of the nearby forest. I shone the flashlight on the spot, and the flashes went away. But even in that brief second when I illuminated the branches, I knew they were eyes of an animal or something like that. I knew that in the surroundings there were wolves and coyotes, so that I should be careful. But the bad thing is that I didn't have any weapon at my disposal. Anyway, something inside told me that that thing was not a wolf nor an animal, I thought. It could be a person because those eyes looked quite intelligent and were full of malice. I don't know how I knew this. Maybe I perceived it, but the thing is that I put myself on alert. So, with my hands shaking, I started to change the wheel while the shadow in the forest seemed to be lurking. Every click of the key resonated like an ominous echo in the darkness. I kept looking out of the corner of my eye at the forest because I was sure those eyes were following me, always watching, hiding in the darkness. I finished changing the tire, and I quickly returned to the cabin, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. I advanced a few kilometers, and suddenly another thunderous explosion broke the tranquility. Curse, another tire had punctured. I couldn't believe how unlucky I was. So, I started thinking that this wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe that thing in the forest, whatever it was somehow involved with these incidents. It's like it wanted to stop me, as if it punctured the tires on purpose so that I would get off the truck. I decided not to give in, and I continued on. The truck shook with every meter it advanced with the damaged wheel. But at that time, I would never have stopped the vehicle. I drove another 200 meters, and again another wheel burst a third time. It could no longer be simply a coincidence. Now I had no doubt that that thing in the forest was trying to stop my march. I could not go on moving forward anymore, so I stopped the truck and called for help through the radio. While I waited for assistance, I noticed the shadow of the forest approaching around me. I heard creaks and scratches that resonated in the body of the truck. Something was out there. Something was trying to get in. I don't know how many minutes passed. I just closed my eyes and prayed the Lord's Prayer over and over again. When I opened them again, there was a light. Out there was the mechanic's truck, flashing its lights at me, telling me that he had arrived. Without daring to get out through the window, I explained my strange experience, and with skepticism, he examined the tires and told me something I didn't expect. "Hey man, but they're all in perfect condition. What's this?" I could be a true skeptic. I got off the truck and checked the tires. They were like new. The mechanic looked at me seriously and thought I was playing a trick on him. But at that moment, he saw that I was pale and trembling. In that moment, he asked me what had happened, and I told him everything about the eyes in the forest, about the tires that seemed to have been punctured on purpose, and everyone who I felt. The mechanic, after listening to me, said something very strange. He said that that area was known to be a witch's land. He explained to me that these creatures played with people's minds by inducing hallucinations to make them abandon their vehicles and so attack them. A few minutes later, we said goodbye, and each went his way. I did not have any incidents that night, and whenever I can, I avoid crossing that road, especially after the sun goes down. Good night, my name is Javier. I wanted to tell my story. I know that every time I tell it, many people don't believe me or think that I hallucinated everything. But I am sure of what I saw. To start from boy, I always had some kind of strange perception, if you want to call it that. For example, my parents always told me they said that when I was 5 or 6 years old, I used to play with an imaginary friend that I had even given him a name, Tomas. They said that I always spoke to Tomas in a loud voice and that I played with him several times. My parents thought it was just a prank between kids. Until one day I started saying that Tomas was a child who had died a long time ago, about 20 years ago, right in that same house. Then my parents investigated for their account, and a neighbor told them that, in fact, about 2 decades ago, a child had died of a serious illness in that bedroom. After his death, the family moved, and he never heard from them again. My parents were very afraid and did a spiritual cleansing in the house. But anyway, I continued talking calmly with Tomas, and I did it mainly because of the many times at night they would find the bedroom door closed, and that once they even heard a voice. That voice was not mine, and he laughed with a high-pitched child's laugh. My parents say that I stopped seeing him from one day to the next. It seemed like Tomas didn't want to talk to me about that anymore. It was when I turned 7 years old. Anyway, any eye was always characterized by having that perception that many people believe does not exist, but in reality, I can tell you that yes, it really does exist. I have had dreams many times which an uncle dream or a relative died, and 2 days later, effectively, they called us, saying that the guy I had dreamed about had passed away. Recently, another thing that always happens to me is that sometimes I can see the aura of people. I realize I can tell right away if someone is very depressed or has hateful thoughts. I can tell right away when they enter the room because something changes in the air. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but it's like an oppressive sensation that I feel in my ears and throat. I tell you all this so you know that I am always perceptive to this kind of things, and it is not surprising that I can see things that others don't see. I dedicate myself to being a truck driver. I have an own truck in which I transport all types of merchandise. Generally, I do my daytime trips during daytime only, although if the situation is very urgent, I also drive at night. But if I can avoid it, I only do it during the day because on the roads, there are many times I also tend to see things, especially when everything is quiet. Over time, I realized that the spirits prefer solitary places, places where they feel cannot be disturbed. At night, they are always with us all the time, but it is at night when you can see them better. Perhaps because everything is quieter and calmer, and one's mind becomes more relaxed, as I have almost always seen night people hitchhiking at night on the side of the road, and then, when I look in the rearview mirror, they are no longer the same. When I drive through places on the roads where this paranormal activity is quite frequent, everything happens on the curves and on the most dangerous roads. Once, I saw a woman standing on the side. She was on the shoulder, signaling for me to come over. I stopped, however, so I realized it was a spirit, and I continued on. 2 nights later, I saw her again, always making the same signs. There I was, so I realized I was standing too close to the road, with one foot dangerously stuck on it. Then I realized he says that perhaps she had died that way, hitchhiking and being run over by some unsuspecting driver. A few weeks later, I passed by that place again, but this time during the day, and I realized that due to the shortage of the light of the nights before, I had not seen near where that was woman. There was a cross. I stopped and read the name of a certain Francesca Mondano, and I knew it was that same woman. According to the cross, she had died at the age of 45 years old. So, well, the thing is that for those reasons, I always avoid driving at night. Not because I am afraid of spirits, but because after seeing them, or when I perceive them, I feel very low on energy, as so if these entities are trying to absorb the energy, and then it is very difficult for me to complete the course. Sometimes I have even fallen asleep at the wheel. Now that this long introduction is over, I'm going to tell you what happened to me about 3 months ago, just when I was returning from going to look for some objects in a house in Monterey. The A family had moved and wanted to get rid of their belongings of the previous owner's belongings. This owner was none other than the grandfather of one who had lived in that house for a long time, more than for decades, and the woman wanted to get rid of all his belongings because she apparently had not gotten along with the old man in life. This type of conflict is usually quite common, and I am used to them, so I generally do not pay attention when they talk to me about old family feuds. But there was something in the words of this woman that, on that occasion, made me pay a lot of attention. My grandfather was a very tough and very bad man. She told me while I was loading the truck with her belongings. The woman was quite attractive, about in her 30s, and seemed very friendly, so I knew she wanted to tell this story to someone. So, this time, I heard it. My grandfather abandoned my grandmother, she said, when they were young, and went on a trip for a whole year. I know that she was in very exotic places like Egypt and South Africa, and when he returned, he was no longer that himself. He practiced witchcraft and black magic. My grandmother died a few years later, and even then, my grandfather did not take care of his children who grew up in an orphanage. Meanwhile, my grandfather lived very comfortably in his large house in Monterey. I know that he later married again and had a son, whose new mother died, and apparently the child was also given away for adoption, although I'm not very clear about that story. My grandfather died alone, and I'm glad to know it because he was a very despicable man. That's why I want you, sir, to take all his belongings. Don't leave anything here that will remind me of him. Those were the words of the woman who, after venting with her testimony, went into the house to continue doing other chores. I finished loading the truck near sunset. The woman wanted me to take the things to an antique shop in Saltillo. She said she didn't want to leave it in some store in the city because she was afraid of seeing their things in passing during a walk. So, I had about an hour-and-a-half drive, and I would arrive at dusk. So, after finishing, I said goodbye to the woman and started the road. The road was quite quiet, and it looked like the night would be peaceful. I drove peacefully for several kilometers until suddenly I started to feel ill. First, it was a very strong headache that struck me across my temples. I suppressed an aspirin, and then continued driving. My hands and arms began to go numb, and I had to shake them several times to get the feeling of touch back. So, I was already a little scared. I thought I was getting a stroke or something. So, I decided to stop in a cafeteria, rest for a few minutes, and have some water. Nearby, there was a restaurant, so I parked the truck in the parking lot and got out to order the drink. I sat at the bar for a while. In all that time, not a single person entered the place. The bar was a dive. When I was done, a woman who was in from the back room called me. "Sir, don't forget the boy," she told me with a smile, maybe meaning boy. I turned around, thinking that she was playing some kind of joke on me. I asked her what boy she was speaking about. The woman blinked several times, then looked across the bar and frowned. The boy you came with. A boy I saw clearly coming behind you." "I thought you were coming together." I said, "No, I came alone." She didn't think she was wrong. I returned to make sure I returned to the truck, and I felt a little better, although it hadn't gotten dark too fast too quickly either, so I had to turn on the lights to get back onto the road. I turned on the radio to distract myself a little, but after a while I heard something in the back of the truck, so I turned the volume down and listened. After a while, the noise was repeated again. It was as if someone was scratching the packaging boxes or was breaking them one by one. It was then that I thought about what had said that woman in the bar, the boy. Perhaps it was one of those homeless children who were out there looking to steal something. Maybe he had gotten into my truck while I was drinking my water in the bar. I stopped the truck on the side of the road. It was very dark and quiet. Even the sound of the crickets could be heard. I knew that many children were armed with knives, so I had to be very careful. Of course, I didn't think I would start fighting with a child, but at least I had to find something to defend myself with. I decided to use my leather jacket as a shield, and so I headed to the back of the truck. I opened the door and lit up the inside with a flashlight, and there was something strange. The boxes were intact. Even so, I wanted to make sure, and I got into the trailer and looked behind some of the boxes and in the corners. Nothing was there. I was about to return to the cabin when again I heard that rascui scratching sound. It came from one of the larger boxes. I knew that inside there was an old leather armchair. I was about to come closer to examine it when, then, I felt that old and familiar sensation that I was feeling, that I wasn't alone, that something from another world was there with me. It was just for a second, and in that second I realized that, for the first time, that entity was not nothing good. A shiver ran through my body from top to bottom. I knew something was in there and wanted to hurt me. I quickly got out of the trailer and jumped toward the road. I pushed the door to close it, but before I could activate the lock, something close, something on the other side pushed me violently and threw me toward the dust of the shoulder. I stood up quickly. For the first time in my entire life, I felt terrified in front of one of my visions. I tried to close the door again. Then, when I looked inside, I swear I saw some eyes between the packing bulges, yellow ones that looked at me with so much hate. My heart stopped. I knew that I was in danger. I pushed the door with all my strength, and this time I could close it, and I quickly ran to the cabin and started to lock the engine. Inside, I repeated over and over again an old prayer that my mother had taught me. "O Mother, in my name, in the name of God, Almighty God, may all evil spirits depart from me, and that the good ones of my serve as my protection against them." I did it again and again and again. Over time, I began to feel a little calmer, and I naively believed that I believed the worst had already passed. I continued driving for about 15 minutes. I was focused on the road, but at that time, a part of me remained alert, waiting to hear new noises in the trailer. Around about 9:15, I started to smell a bad smell. I thought it was coming from some outside, perhaps from some dead animal, dog, or something like CNTUR. But then I realized that it was coming from inside the same cabin as the cabin itself. I lowered my window, and then, when I bent down to take out an air freshener spray, I saw something sitting next to me. It was sitting a motionless shadow that I saw out of the corner of my eye. I didn't want to move or turn around completely, to avoid seeing its face, so I could only see part of its body and head, which seemed stripped bare of all hair, so that in the dim light dimness of the cabin, it resembled a bald head or a pumpkin. I closed my eyes for a second and tried to conjure my mother's prayer, but for some reason I couldn't say it either out loud or even inside my mind. It was as though if that simple prayer had become an impossible tongue twister to pronounce, and I said it in any order. "In the name of God Almighty, all evil spirits stay away. Serve protection, spirits, good spirits." Even though I concentrated with all my strength, I could not say that simple prayer, and at that moment, I felt that the symptoms that I had experienced a few minutes earlier returned with great intensity. A headache, numbness in my arms and hands, and then the worst of all, I feel that laugh. A laugh that came from my right side where that one was sitting next to me. Laughs mine was the darkest and most sinister laugh I've ever heard in my life. I felt like crying and throwing myself out of the truck, even though it was going at a speed of 80 kilometers per hour. However, after a while, instead of trying to repeat that prayer, I just started saying, "Mother, please help me. Father, please save me." And mysteriously, that did work because, after a while, that apparition stopped being seen. I made the rest of the journey trembling and in a very high state of nervousness. I think, at that moment, I had a fever and mouth. The owner of the antique shop was waiting for me, despite the schedule, and seeing me arrive in such bad shape, got scared and called the ambulance. They checked me out and gave me a couple of painkillers. The owner of the store was very kind and offered me his house to stay the night, but I declined and told him that I just wanted to sleep in my bed, still remembering the horrible experience I had during the trip. I felt the need to alert you about that cargo that apparently carried something much more chilling than simple old furniture. I repeated to the shop owner the story that the woman had told me, and then I told him about my experience during the transfer, and the businessman listened to me attentively and then nodded seriously, looking at the packages he had just gone down, because it's not the first time I've heard something like that. Sometimes things remain imbued with the spirit of the former owner, but over time I discovered that it is, above all, the evil spirits who decide to stay here. They are still attracted to the earthly. They want to live again, eat, and smoke. That's why they are so harmful. But don't worry. I know what to do about it. I know people who are in charge of cleaning these objects. After all, I can sell haunted merchandise that would ruin my business. I stayed reassured to know that this man already had experience with that type of cargo. So, I got back on the truck and started the way back, wondering if that entity that I had seen sitting next to me was the woman's grandfather, and what relationship did he have with that boy who had followed me, the one who had climbed into the back of the truck. That's when I remembered what had happened. The woman said that the old man had had another son and that he had apparently given him away for adoption. But what if he had killed him? I don't know. They are things I think about at night, especially when I can't sleep, that the world is full of good people, but also of people who, for some reason, decide to do evil, and that he never gives up his horrible intentions, not even after death. How are you, listeners? I hope you liked the previous story very well. Let's go with the next dot. Hello, good afternoon. I thought about it for a long time and finally decided to tell my story. The reason for my hesitation is due to my higher rank of military, where it can happen. That, if my superiors discover this, yes, if they find out I'm talking about this kind of thing about my job, they might get me fired. Or, at least, my reputation would be marked forever, so I trust that you will keep my name anonymous as well, as you will understand that I cannot give specific directions about places. I will only say that I am from Ecuador, and I have been doing military service since I was 20 years old, and I did it more by family mandate than by vocation, that is to say that my father was a soldier, as was my grandfather. At first, I didn't like this job too much, but then you get used to it and start to see the positive things. For example, it is a stable job, and if one tries hard enough, you can rise to higher ranks. In my case, I work at a naval base in Ecuador, where they carry out maintenance on vessels, in addition to exercises, simulations, military maneuvers, etc. A great part of the time on a boat, although this boat does not make very long trips. We often go out to sea in search of fishing boats, and it is, or for any other irregular situation that may arise over our Ecuadorian sea. And it was precisely on one of these missions that what I am going to tell you happened. Next, I know that many on this channel believe in paranormal things. In fact, I am sure that's why you hear these stories. But the truth is that, until it happened to me, I didn't believe in this at all. In fact, things have always seemed absurd. To me, things without any sense. However, during the summer of 2021, what I saw made me completely change my mind to the point that, even today, I believe in other spiritual forces, and also, in a certain way, I feel closer to God. As I was saying, we were on a mission in search of illegal Chinese fishing boats, when my crew saw a boat drifting about 500 meters from the coast. We approached this boat, which was a typical fishing vessel, about 20 or 30 years old, and was in fairly well condition, about 24 meters long. We boarded the boat because the previous notice received no response. We inspected the ship. It seemed to have been abandoned in a very hasty manner, as we found remains of food and drinks, as if the crew had been surprised or forced to leave in the middle of dinner or lunch. Beyond that, there was no other trace to indicate why the crew was not there, and they had left the boat adrift. As is common in these cases, we gave a report on the radio and proceeded to take the ship to port for later identification. It was on this trip that the events that I am going to relate below happened. I, as second in command, had taken charge of the abandoned ship and assumed it would be a smooth and quick trip to the port, Bolivar. However, after a few minutes, One of my men said that the ship housed people who were hidden under the bulkheads. Of course, that is impossible, since these ships are designed in a very precise way, and the plate that covers the hull is barely a few centimeters of separation with respect to the wood of the exterior. However, this sailor claimed to have seen some 5 people, all of Oriental appearance, descending the bow ladder towards the east cabins. The sailor followed them and found that they were no longer there, so he arrived at the conclusion that they were hidden under the hull. And why did you come to that conclusion, sailor? Well, because I saw something in a corner near the ground. It was like a trail in a cloud of black vapor. The trail disappeared among the floor to the ground, and the black cloud dissipated, was his strange explanation. But, sailor, what you tell me is impossible and has nothing to do with logic, I answered, losing my patience and deciding to forget the incident. However, about 5 minutes later, the boat's engine emitted a strange creaking and smoke started. Coming out of the engine room, we went down to check, and we realized that 2 of the main engines had melted down. I asked for help by radio. We had lost sight of our military ship, and I thought it shouldn't be far away. However, when I looked towards the horizon and saw that there was only a huge and seemingly endless expanse of sea, the coast that had been visible just a few minutes before had disappeared. 300 or 400 meters. I consulted with the helmsman, who said he felt as surprised as I thought that perhaps a fog bank had risen near the coast and was forming an optical illusion that deceived our eyes. As the radio did not respond, I asked again for help. Then I heard something like laughter, very annoying. I took the radio and warned those jokers that they were on a military frequency channel and that they should leave immediately. In response, I only received more laughter, so I recorded the incident that they would subsequently investigate and punish those jokers. The mechanic on board approached me. Sir, these engines can be repaired with the spare parts and tools we have on the boat, but it will take me some time, maybe 2 or 3 hours, to repair at least 1 engine and get closer to the shore. I told him that was fine and that we could give him that time. The mechanic went down to the engine room to begin repairs. The crew, in the meantime, had become very nervous. Many looked at the deck, looking for land. A sailor said that his watch had stopped at the very moment another had boarded the ship. He said the same thing about his mobile phone. It is forbidden to carry this type of device during our missions. However, I was very puzzled, so I let those infractions that the sailor had so innocently confessed go. Suddenly, we were all there, without knowing what to do, as we had nothing to do. We started to help the mechanic, reaching the engine room, hoping to finish the task as soon as possible. While we were working, an officer said he was sure that that ship was haunted, and that was why its previous crew had abandoned it. As superior in command, I could not allow a subordinate to say that kind of thing, so I made him shut up, but, seeing the looks of the other sailors, I realized that they all thought the same thing. That strange abandoned boat in the middle of the sea, something was wrong with it. Maybe an hour passed, and one of the officers went up on deck to see if he could see a ship that could help them. After a while, he returned, all pale, and said that the sea around the ship was covered with a kind of very thick mist that made it impossible to see, beyond 50 meters around us. We climbed to the deck, and we found that what the sailor said was true. Never in my life had I seen something like that. It seemed like the fog was surrounding us. I tried to keep calm, and I proposed to keep a guard in the watchtower. This seemed to calm my men, but only for a while. Then they got nervous again when one of them said he had seen an oriental-looking woman walking like a spider along the side railing of the ship. It was getting dark, so we had to use the spotlights to try to catch a glimpse of that supposed woman. But, unfortunately, we couldn't find anything. However, it caught our attention. Something very close to the bow of the ship was only a second in which something white and agile appeared on the surface. I could not see with precision, but there were other sailors who told me that it was a completely hairless and bald face with fish-shaped eyes. Something that peeked out quickly and then returned to the depths. Gentlemen, you are letting your imagination and fear get the better of you. You are members of the Naval, Navy, and cannot allow yourselves to believe in superstitious matters. You must behave like rational officers, or I swear I'll reveal them from those positions when we manage to get out of here. I barely finished saying this when that thing peeked out again. This time, it was for a longer time, maybe about 5 seconds, in which we were completely stunned. It was something I had never seen before. It looked like a big fish, about 2 or 3 meters, but with a horribly human face. That thing looked at us for a few seconds with totally heartless eyes. It was like he was a shark, and then he just disappeared again from the surface. That was reason enough for my men to completely lose their cool. They were sure that the ship was not only haunted, but that it also attracted all kinds of dark entities that lived in the sea. One of them even begged me that we should get out of here. Another said that was what happened to the men who were on this boat before. He said that maybe they saw all kinds of things and finally jumped to the sea, preferring death rather than continue terrified in this ship. His words left us speechless. I don't know why, but I knew that the sailor was right. I knew that was the fate that had been in store for those mysterious crew members. At that moment, I ordered everyone to calm down and go help the mechanic immediately so we could get out of here as quickly as possible. Everyone obeyed and went to help the mechanic, who concluded that his tasks would be ready in about half an hour. By then, we heard a series of strange creaks mixed with screams. All seemed to come from inside the ship. This time, none of us dared to look for the origin. We just limited ourselves to being close to each other, unable to rest. The ship looked like a horror movie set. Shadows, sounds, voices that were lost in the air. It was incredible, but we were only 7 highly trained and strong-willed men. However, all of them had succumbed to panic in the face of a series of events that we could not explain. We started the engine that the mechanic had repaired. When consulting with the ship's control panel, we realized that the coordinate indicator had gone crazy. Just like the GPS, it was at that moment that we decided to be guided by our instinct. We were sure that we had seen land at a certain point on the horizon that had now disappeared because of the mist. We decided to follow this instinct and head there. At first it seemed that we were advancing, piercing that mysterious mist that had settled around us, but then we had the suspicion that we were always in the same place, something that prevented us from moving forward, something that we could not see or much less understand. Then, one of my men, who was a deeply religious man, knelt on the deck and began to pray. Very soon, my other men imitated him, and after a while, we were all, including me, that I was always an atheist, praying to God to allow us to return home. After a while, one of the officers pointed his finger in a direction and said he thought he had seen lights ahead, and gave orders to the helmsman to rev the engine to full throttle. In the following minutes, it seemed that we were really moving forward, and another of my men also said he had seen lights in the middle of that fog. But still, something else was waiting for us. We had already seen land, and we were shouting with joy when, suddenly, something seemed to hit the keel of the ship. The blow was so violent that it threw us all onto the wooden floor of the deck, and one of my men even fell into the sea. We quickly organized to rescue this poor man, who was trying to reach us with desperate strokes. We threw him the life preserver. The officer clung to it, but we soon saw that something behind his body was holding him, continuing to leave a trail. On the surface, we realized that, very soon, it would reach him. My men began to shoot in the direction of that thing that was rapidly approaching the officer. I think he never knew what was happening. He just started screaming in fear when he perceived that the blades were passing by his head. After several efforts, we managed to get the officer back on the boat, and it was then that we saw that that thing had a very stretched pink body with tentacles around it. I must clarify that it was not an octopus or a squid. It was something that none of us had ever seen, a creature. When it discovered that it had not caught its prey, it took out its monstrous head, the size of a mid-size car, and uttered a blood-curdling scream that burst our eardrums and made us dizzy for a few seconds. After that, it disappeared from the surface. A few minutes later, at last, we reached land. All of us trembled with fear and adrenaline. We were sure that we had just seen things that remain hidden in an underworld that we did not even suspect. We quickly got off the boat and tied it up, and as soon as we touched land, the radio started working again. There, I took the opportunity to ask for help, and while we were awaiting the rescue, the last mysterious event happened. That ship, without anyone releasing it from its mooring, began to move away from the shore silently. No one drove it. Its engines did not work. However, that ship moved away quickly, and we soon lost sight of it in the mist. Mysteriously, a few minutes later, the police boat arrived and rescued us. By mutual agreement, none of us said anything about it. At the request of explanations that the boat officer made, we said that we had lost the rescued boat, and that it had been anchored somewhere in Alamo. We never knew about that ship, but I'm sure it's still sailing the wide seas of the Pacific, with its aura and mysterious magnetism. I would like to think that it finally sank and now rests in the depths of the sea. And I think that would be the best, but I'm almost sure that is not so. How are you, listeners? I hope you have enjoyed this story very much. Now, let's go with the next dot. Good evening, community. My name is Alberto. I am originally from Sonora. All my life, I have traveled a large part of the country, from north to south and from east to west, since I am a military man with a high rank. You know that the life of the military often consists of patrolling different zones of the country, all depending on the needs and circumstances of the country. I have moved around 5 or 6 times throughout my life, but I don't complain. It's something I know is part of my job. Therefore, I know a large part of the country. I know all its climates, its people, and I have lived many experiences. The story I am going to tell you happened quite a while ago, when I was just a private. I was no more than 23 years old at that time. There were no cell phones, there was no WhatsApp. It was just emerging. The internet was a totally different world than it is now. Speaking of the late 90s, there was much more closeness to the paranormal at that time. So now, I'm not saying that people don't believe, but more and more, I meet many more skeptics. When this happened, I was in the Chiapas area, in the middle of the war against drug trafficking. It was really very hard, since we fought against armed factions and with technology that even sometimes outnumbered us. But we were more, and we had the support of the governments of Mexico and the United States. It was during one of those days when we were assigned a mission to the Blue Mountains of Chiapas, where several crops were supposedly hidden that were heavily guarded by armed terrorist forces. Since we were a reconnaissance group, we had to move with stealth, and we were few. Armed confrontation was not yet planned. We only had to recognize the terrain and identify, if possible, the shelters of those terrorists. We were a group of 6 soldiers plus the corporal. During the first day, we advanced through the mountains and hills. At certain times, the terrain became very leafy and difficult to advance. The whole place was covered by swamps, abundant vegetation, and, of course, by mosquitoes that were sometimes as big as wasps, not to mention the danger of snakes. Many times, the snake could not penetrate the boot with its fangs, but it could bite above the boot near the knee, and that could cause serious problems. Among all these inconveniences of nature, we advanced step by step until we arrived at a clearing where a column of smoke could be seen through some trees, and we knew we were close to some village. Generally, the villagers who were linked to drug traffickers never say anything, all because they receive, in return, some kind of compensation, like food, drink, and all those things. Nevertheless, we approached that village to try to see if we could find any clue. It was a group of no more than 10 houses, hidden in the mountains. These houses were very precarious, built with wood, mud, and thatched roofs. Our corporal led us without hesitation into the village. We saw about 12 or 13 people working on different tasks. Some were farming on small strips of land, others were cutting firewood, and some were just sitting on wooden logs, smoking cigarettes. When they saw us, they didn't even seem surprised. Those people were already used to receiving visits from soldiers who, just like us, were looking for hidden drug dealers and illegal crops. There were a couple of old men who seemed to be the leaders, and we approached them and asked them about the existence of armed people linked to drug trafficking. The old men looked at us and smiled. Then one of them asked us, in a rather insolent way, why we thought they would help. "Sir, we are chasing criminals. We are here to protect the interests of the country and, obviously, helping you," our response was. Hearing this, the old man laughed. "You can't protect us. You're welcome. We are in the middle of a war, and no one cares about us. We only count with the protection of Mama. She always protected us, and thanks to her, we are still here, alive, raising our children and grandchildren and having several plates of food a day." We asked who Mama Kara was, and the old man replied, "She is our spiritual guide and who protects us. That is why we tell you that we do not care for their protection, nor are we intimidated by their weapons. We were curious. After all, we were in a place lost in the middle of the forest, and there was little to see there." The old man spoke of a mystery we had never heard of before. "Excuse me, sir, but could you take us to talk to Mama?" I asked. The old man shrugged his shoulders. "Sure, but I don't think she talks to you. She talks very little. In fact, in the last 5 years, she has only said 2 things. One to warn us of an earthquake, and another to tell us that the fire would reach the forest and that we should move to another place." With this, the old man led us to a place a little further away from the rest of the houses. There was a stone construction about 2 meters high and 2 meters long, almost attached to a huge tree with thick roots. She lives here, never goes out, or almost never, but when she does, it is always at night because the sun bothers her in the eyes. The old man stopped in front of the wooden door of that small construction. "I'm just going to let you be with her for a minute because she can get upset and you won't want to see her angry." And so, he opened the door. Unconsciously, I brought my hands to my weapon. I noticed that my other companions were also somewhat tense, but, above all, Curious to know who or what was on the other side, the old man asked us to enter. The place was too small, and as soon as we entered, we all stayed looking at the center of that small room. There was a kind of bed or couch made of stone and straw, and on this bed there was something that looked like a mummy. I think it was something very similar to the mummies of the famous museum of Guanajuato. It was obvious that that woman couldn't be alive. Her clothes were covered in dust. Her arms were little more than bones covered with dry, greyish skin. Her legs were not thicker than a stick. A few strands of hair sprouted from her head, dull, brittle hair. Her eyes were sunken into dark sockets and seemed like two raisins. The skin of the face also looked rough and stuck to the bones. The body didn't even move. Our corporal approached the old woman. Then he put his ear to the old woman's mouth and listened for a few seconds. Then he sat up and looked at the old man. This woman is dead. She doesn't even breathe. But the old man laughed. That's what it looks like. But she continues breathing very slowly, so much so that it is almost imperceptible. I think she breathes once every 5 minutes or so. That's all her body needs. Also, she eats very little. The last time we tried food was about 3 months ago. We realized that we were facing a possible ghost or perhaps some ancient superstitious belief of that village. I imagined how that old woman had been very important to that small group of people. Without doubt, she had been a leader, and everyone had trusted her. But then the old woman died, and people around seemed to wanted to believe that she was still alive, so they could find comfort and not feel so sad, terrified by the old woman. It made me sad to think that these people lived in the middle of nowhere, surviving on corn crops grown and a few meager farm animals, isolated from society, without even being able to watch TV or listen to music on the radio. It seemed to me that they lived in very sad way. Although, of course, I was seeing everything with my eyes, as of a civilized man who lives in a more advanced society. Perhaps those people were actually happier. We walked away from that place, thinking that we had seen too much, and, at the same time, almost nothing had happened, because we had no report to raise to our superiors about. The corporal proposed to stay to watch near the village, in case guerrillas were lurking around or visiting the village in search of food for supplies. We set up camp about 2 kilometers from there, in the middle of the forest. The first night we had a very peaceful time. There were hardly any incidents. But at dusk the next day, the problems began. Shots were heard in the distance. The boss corporal ordered us to investigate the area, dividing us into groups of 2. I went intended to cover the northern part of the village where that mummified old woman was. I hid behind some bushes to watch over the village. Everything seemed totally calm. There was no one outside, although some candle flames could be seen flickering inside the houses. There was also a lot of silence. However, after a while, I could see that a figure was moving between the houses, struggling with another person. I realized it was one of the guerrillas who had a girl of about 12 years old held in his hands. The man was armed and threatened to shoot anyone who approached. He opened a door, and a man in his 30s confronted the offender, demanding that he leave his daughter alone. In response, the despicable subject shot at the father's feet, who backed away and went back into his house. Then the criminal dragged the girl along the dirt road and set out to abuse her over some herbs. I was ready to get into action and teach that despicable being a lesson. But before I could come out of my hiding place and shoot him in the head, something happened. The wooden door of that stone construction attached to the tree The gorilla was opened. The gorilla was with his back turned to it, about 5 meters away, and never noticed anything such thing inside something. Something came out of that stone room, from that inside. It was something surprising. The woman came out. That mummy was incredibly moving in a very fast and almost spasmodic fast manner. In a second, she covered the moment distance that separated her from the gorilla and rushed at him. The woman came rushing at her. The mummy gorilla let out a surprised shout, startled her, and tried to scream, "Get the old woman off him," but she seemed to be quite strong. Meanwhile, the attacked girl took the opportunity and escaped towards the houses of the village. I watched everything from behind my hiding place. Stunned, I could not believe what I saw that I believed. It seemed impossible that woman could still be alive. I noticed that the skin on her body was completely dry and had hardly any meat. However, it seemed to have too much strength because the criminal had power. Couldn't move, get rid of her off. The old woman's skeletal arms held him tenaciously by the neck. Their arms were unyielding. Then I saw the woman open, her mouth full of rotten teeth, between which stuck out a blackish, dry tongue. And then she embedded those teeth in the head of the man's head. The gorilla's man. He screamed, and cried for help, but no one could get rid of her off it. From her old woman's arms held him. From her village houses nearby came nothing. No one came out. The old woman, if she really was an old woman, that she really was, ground her teeth into the head of the individual's head. This time I saw that, in addition to the scalp too, she tore off a piece of skull helmet, skull that broke like with a crunch. The body of the subject danced desperately. His arms and legs moved in violent convulsions. The old woman attacked again, and this time she tore out a piece of his brain. Immediately, the man's subject's rolled eyes back in his head, and then he stopped screaming and move. The woman, still hugging him, who has dedicated herself to absorbing the blood with his blood, with greed that greedily sucked, which made me nauseated me. The old woman, I could not stand it any longer, and I vomited up on the ground, some bushes. The mummy continued eating for a few moments. Moments later, she seemed to be satisfied, and, with some satisfied movements quite slowly, she slowly returned to moved her back to her stone dwelling. Before she closed door behind her, I saw her turn her head back towards the direction where I was at. Is impossible that she could have seen me among the weeds in the darkness. However, darkness, I would have sworn made that woman's lips I saw formed a grim smile, as though if she knew that I was there, looking at everything with terrified eyes. Seconds later, my comrades' companions arrived, alerted by the screams and the shots, and only then did I dare to come out of my hiding place, out. The corporal observed the gorilla lying dead on the grass with his head smashed, and asked if anyone knew what had happened to him. That nobody had happened. Nobody said anything, and I didn't dare to say anything either. I don't know why I didn't dare to open my mouth. Perhaps for fear that no one would believe my story. For a few moments, we stood there in silence. Then, one of the village elders who had introduced us to the mummified mummy old woman appeared. He also looked at the dead gorilla, then smiled and nodded his head. I told them that Mummy Kara took care of us. The corporal ordered the transfer from the body to the camp. The return was very long and laborious, since we had to carry the body on a stretcher once we arrived at the camp. Base doctors were dedicated to examining the body, and the police personnel tried finding out his identity. It was not difficult for them to do so, since the subject had a wallet with several documents inside. It was found to belong to a member of an armed terrorist organization dedicated to transporting drugs across the border with Guatemala. In contrast, the reasons for his death were not so easy to establish. One doctor said he had been attacked by a bear. Another said the opposite and argued that he had died from a terrible blow to the head. Only I knew the real reasons. I remember that old mummy inside that stone room. I'm sure he's still there with that corpse-like appearance, but I know that it is just a deceptive appearance. That thing must still continue taking care of his own, and God help him who dares to challenge her. What's up, listeners? I hope you liked the previous story. Very well, let's go with the next. I didn't know whether to share my experience because I thought no one would believe me. But I see that there are people like me, professionals, who have had similar experiences. So, I'm going to tell my story. Here, I am a transporter. For 5 years now, my name is David, and I am Colombian. I work carrying sugarcane from the sugarcane fields of Valle del Cauca to the mills where the product is processed and turned into sugar. Generally, I did the work in the morning hours, and the transfer to the mills does not take much time. Everything was very routine, about 8 hours of work while the truck is being loaded, transported, unloaded, and always. It is the law of truckers that we always check the condition of the vehicle. At the beginning of the day, check the oil, gasoline, tires, and everything else. You have to check that everything is in order. At the end of the day, we go to the company, we leave the truck, and we go to our houses. All was pretty normal until one day I had to go to a plantation of some products from a rural area a little further away than what I was used to. On a very bad day, water was falling in jugs, and the sound of thunder was deafening. The truck felt very slippery as well. I had to go slowly and carefully, going through a very bumpy road, or, as we say here, a car. At that moment, I felt a rather strong blow on the bottom of the vehicle, and that stopped the vehicle. The first thing I could think was that I messed up. I was too careless with the potholes in the road, and perhaps I had passed through a puddle much deeper than it seemed at first glance. I tried to accelerate the vehicle, and nothing, it didn't move. The truth is that at that moment, the first thing that occurred to me was to use the vehicle radio. But there was a lot of interference, and I couldn't communicate with anyone. I also tried to check if I had a signal on my cell phone to inform the boss of the situation, but unfortunately, I didn't have a single signal line. Despite the downpour, I decided to get off the truck to check what was failing, and it turned out that I had the left and front tires stuck in a very deep puddle that didn't allow traction for my truck. I got back in the truck to try to start again, but nothing was moving. At that moment, I started to get quite stressed because it was already getting dark, and it didn't seem like there was a trace of life near me to help me. I thought about trying to use a stick or something to get me out of that crappy hole. But the truth is that the truck was very heavy, too heavy for a simple stick to have any impact. When starting, in that moment, I thought that maybe I should get off this old truck and walk until I find someone who would help. But the truth is that even if I found enough people to move the truck, I didn't believe that they were going to want to get wet to help me. Finally, what I decided was to wait in my truck until the rain calmed down, and so I could communicate using the radio or cell phone. The sky was going dark more and more, and you could hardly see anything around that damn vehicle. The downpour seemed eternal, and I just wanted to eat something hot and be able to go to my house. While I was lost in my thoughts with the sound of the rain in the background, I managed to perceive that between one of the crops adjacent to the road came out a person raising his hands and gesturing for me to approach. He was a man who, from a distance, looked middle-aged and dark-skinned, tall, and wearing clothes that looked like a field worker's. It seemed strange to me that he was exposed to the downpour like this just to help me. At the moment, I didn't trust because the crime situation in the country is quite strong, and I thought that maybe it was intentional, but after his insistence, I decided to gesture for him to wait for me, and then I got off the truck to talk to him. When I was already arriving where he was, he offered his help with the truck, and I told him that we needed more people to get it out of the jam. He told me that he was willing to help and offered me a hot cup of coffee and to spend the rain under a roof while he brought his friends. I accepted his help and asked him why he was there. He told me he was a field worker and was dedicated to cutting sugarcane in that region in exchange for a few pesos. He didn't tell me his name. He just guided me along a path between the crops until reaching a small ranch with an old mattress, a kitchenette, and some benches. He told me he lived there and managed to see my truck in the distance. He saw that I needed help and approached because he would have liked someone to help him in the same way. At that moment, I didn't quite understand what he was referring to, but after this, he served me a cup of hot coffee. The truth is that it tasted pretty good, even though I knew it wasn't the best quality. We started enjoying it while I waited for the rain to stop. The truth is that at that moment, despite the cold in the air, I felt the warmth. That moment felt like I was in the company of a lifelong friend. The silence was interrupted by a question from the man. He asked me if I believed in God. I told him that I did consider myself a believer in the Almighty and that I entrusted myself to him. The man, whose name I didn't know, told me, "That's a good answer." When the rain stopped, the man told me to wait for him in the truck, that he was going to call his friends to help me. So, I thanked him for the coffee and headed back to the truck to wait for him. I got back into the driver's seat and waited for him for about 30 minutes, but there was no trace of him or his friends. At that moment, the idea crossed my mind to try to start the truck again and see if, now without the downpour, I had a little more luck. But to my surprise, I was able to get out immediately from the hole it was in, and the radio was already working perfectly. I checked my cell phone, and it also had a signal. There were only a few messages from the boss inquiring about my whereabouts and wondering if I had had any problems. After responding to my boss's messages, I proceeded to drive to the house of the man who had offered me his help to tell him that everything was fine and that he no longer needed to call his friends. By that time, everything was already dark. It was partly illuminated by the light of my truck, and I couldn't see the road well. However, when I was arriving at his ranch, I knew immediately that something was not right. It seemed that his house was charred and the wood was completely black. I illuminated with my cell phone, and everything looked burned and shattered. At that moment, I thought that something had gone wrong in the few 30 minutes I had gone to get the truck, but I found it hard to believe that I hadn't seen the lighting of the fire in the distance, and that there were no objects in the house burning. I became quite worried about him, so I continued down the road with my truck until I found someone who could clear up my doubts about what I had just seen. It was also on the way to the place where I had planned to pick up the shipment of sugarcane, which was very good for me. I arrived at a small house with the light on and knocked on the door, waiting for a response. I was greeted by a man and a girl at the entrance. I greeted them kindly and asked if they knew anything about the man who lived a few houses down. I was wondering if maybe he had come to this house to ask for help. The man looked at me, scared and confused, as if he didn't understand anything I was saying. He told me that the man who lived on that ranch was called Freddie, had died 4 years ago in a fire on his own ranch, and told me that they were both co-workers on the sugarcane plantation and that he was a man who was always willing to help others. At that moment, I felt that the blood drained. I turned pale and everything sank. I didn't believe it was possible that the man with whom I was sharing a hot coffee just a few minutes ago, who was going to help me with the truck, was actually a person who was no longer in this system, this world. I gave my condolences to Freddie's friend and said blessings to him and the little one. I said goodbye and headed to the place where I was to pick up the cargo. While driving, I felt like my hands were shaking. It couldn't be anything but feeling chills running through my body, but something inside me told me that this was a kind soul who only wanted to help the people she met along the way. In the end, I picked up the cargo, and on the way back, I was not able to look at Freddie's burned house because remembering him made me feel really bad. I remembered him telling me that he would have liked someone to help him the same way he helped others. At that moment, I imagined that no one helped him while he was burning alive. When I got back to the main road, I tried to clear my mind and not think much further about the subject until I got home and could tell my wife. I delivered the shipment to the sugar mill normally. Not much else happened that day, apart from a few comments from my boss. Certainly, when I got home, my wife was very surprised by what I was telling her. But she knows that I am a very sincere man and ended up surrendering to reality. She told me that we should pray for Freddie's soul, that we wished him to rest in peace, and from that day on, every night, we asked the Blessed Sacrament for his rest. I continued working as a truck driver since it's all I know how to do. On rare occasions during rainy days, I think I managed to see Freddie waving his hand to me among the sugarcane fields with a friendly smile on his face. Although it no longer scares me, I can only see a soul who spent his whole life helping others and who, even in the afterlife, seeks to perpetuate this noble gesture. How are you, listeners? I hope you liked the previous story. Very well, let's go with the next dot. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Today, I come to tell my story of what happened to me as a taxi driver. I have been in this job for several years. I learned to drive since I was 15, so as soon as I got my license, I looked for a job, and a friend of my dad took me to this. This is how I gradually climbed over the years and got used to this type of employment. For a long time, I never had any setbacks, nor had anything strange happen to me or out of the ordinary. I am from Mexico City, so on the streets, there are always many rumors and legends that people tell. After all, the city has always had an aura of mystery. There are legends of all kinds that have been told to us since we were children, such as the legend of the Charro Negro, La Llorona, the street of Don Juan Manuel, among many others that remain in the minds of Mexicans since time immemorial. Surely, people who are not from the Mexican Republic do not know all our legends, and that is normal. But this time, I'm not going to talk about a legend, but about an even worse fact that surely you wouldn't believe, until that day had passed. It had been like any other. Several passengers had been taken to their destinations, and I had received a good tip for those trips. I've been in this business for 25 years now, so I'm used to the various risks that come with being a taxi driver, such as drunk people, drug dealers, car accidents, among other things that are dangers in this profession. Before finishing my day, I decided to take one last ride from a passenger so I could go home and enjoy quality time with my family. As the Christmas season was approaching, and I was just a few days away from going on vacation, well, at least from my shift, so I could spend the holidays with my loved ones. My last passenger before finishing my shift was a lady a little older than me. It should be noted that I am currently 48 years old, so the lady, who was loaded with shopping, told me to take her a few blocks away near the house of a relative of hers. So I charged her the usual for the trip, and we spent a good while talking about it until we arrived at the destination. I said goodbye to the woman and told her happy holidays and that she should be very careful because it was almost dark. As soon as I saw that the lady left carefully, I started the taxi again and got ready to go home, not without first buying something for one of my younger children. So I wanted to take a shorter route to one of the OXXO stores and looked for one that wasn't too far from the road back to my house. So I went down a street that I thought might give me the shortest route. However, I kept driving and couldn't find an OXXO anywhere. I was still wandering around the streets. Back then, there were no digital maps like Google Maps, so you had to have a good GPS or a map of the city to be able to locate the streets well, and thus avoid getting lost. So I decided to look for people on the street to ask for directions, which I hoped would not be difficult. Little by little, it was getting dark, and people were returning to their homes. So I stood on the corner of a street and saw a man reading a newspaper. I decided to stop and got off. The passenger window stared at me. "Excuse me, sir," I spoke to him, and he stared. Although he took his eyes off his newspaper, "Excuse me, I'm a little lost around here. Can you tell me where the nearest OXXO is?" I asked him, and I noticed that he looked at me strangely. "Wow, so you're not from around here, right?" The man finally addressed me, hiding a slight laugh. "Around here, there are no OXXOs of the kind you speak of. They must be in another area. But if you want to leave, a few blocks to the left, then 2 to the right, and go straight ahead." I didn't want him to see my clear face of confusion. Sometimes I understand that type of directions, but since it was a place I had never set foot in my life, my brain worked in reverse. "Excuse me, sir, could you make me a sketch or something? I can't find my way around these streets." The man rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed. He entered what appeared to be his home and came out with a piece of paper and a pencil. He made several scribbles on the paper. After 2.5 minutes, he handed me the paper. "Here are the directions on how to exit, but don't get confused. Some streets are old, so many may look the same. Just follow the map to the letter, and you will see that you will no longer be lost." "Nod. Have a good afternoon," he said in a dry manner, returning home without looking at me. I looked at the sketch and immediately started the taxi. Now, it shouldn't be so difficult to get out of this street, right? Well, that's what I had thought, but it was not so easy to think what to do. After starting the car, I went to the streets that the man had indicated to me. I was able to pass the first 2 streets successfully, but after the first turn, I realized that something was wrong. I saw the same premises and houses over and over again, which seemed strange to me. I couldn't understand how it was that I always got to the same place. No matter how much I tried to go around, it was as if those streets had no exit. Another idea came to my mind, so I decided to take another route to see if I could find my way home and see my family once and for all. I turned down one of the streets. However, no matter how much I went around and around the endless streets, I couldn't get out of this without going through the same streets, the same houses, and even saw the same faces staring. I started the car to look for another exit. I took another route and continued being in that labyrinthine place. There was no way out. This should not be possible. How the hell did I get to this place? Where the hell was I? I was already starting to despair. So I got out of the car to get some air, and everything looked exactly the same as the typical streets of Mexico. I noticed that people looked at me confused and strange. Just by my face, even though I tried not to show a face of despair, my reaction was obviously noticeable in my actions. I decided to walk along the sidewalk and looked for a person who had maybe one of those old type phones, Nokia or Motorola, a newspaper, or at least could tell me what year and what place we were in. Well, I really thought I was lost, and something told me that I wasn't only lost in space. All the people looked at me strangely. It was as if I was the weird one. It was clear that I was out of place. I didn't fit for obvious reasons. I kept walking until I could find a small place. There, they had a newspaper stand, so I decided to go get one and finally get out of the doubt of where I was. A woman was in my way, so I chivalrously moved her aside, took a newspaper, and looked for the date and year. It was December 18th, 1957. I stayed still when I saw that date. Yes, I was in Mexico, and the date was the same, but it wasn't the same year. I dropped the newspaper on the floor and ran for the same street, looking for my car. No wonder everyone saw me as strange. This wasn't normal. How the hell did I get here in the first place? How the fuck did I time travel? This whole thing seemed like a fucking joke. Soon, I saw my car. I got back in. I was hyperventilating. I felt like I was going to die. My blood pressure dropped, and there was no one at my side who could help me, at least not someone I knew. I had heard of stories of people traveling in time, but this seemed fucking crazy to me. I always believed that those stories were just lies. There was no time for regrets. I had to return to my family and my kids for Christmas, and I wasn't willing to take forever to get back. So I started my car and got ready to go. Following the sketch they had given me, it was a bit wrinkled, but it still worked, and the signs were visible. I continued driving until I could find an exit. However, as I was driving around, I noticed a tall, black, skeletal figure staring at me in the middle of the street in a threatening manner. What the hell was that thing? What was coming towards me? What did it want? Suddenly, as it approached, I saw a huge smile. It did this in a way that was not natural. Its teeth were sharp, and it had a long tongue, and this slimy thing is what brought me to this limbo in the first place. Now I knew it wanted to reap my soul. I started the car at high speed. I no longer cared about anything more than getting out of there. The creepy creature started chasing me. I did what I would never do, drive at high speed. The creature, despite being thin, was not slow, but that gave me an advantage to be able to hear as much as I could. I was there for about 15 minutes, looking for that exit, trying not to get confused again with the paths until, little by little, I was able to finally recognize a street, and that was the one I took to detour. It was already 7 in the evening. I had been 3 damn hours in that place, and I didn't know how much of all of that had been real. When I told this anecdote to my wife and my children, they always think that I was delirious because of the heat or because of things related to my age, or they just think that it's an absurd story. But today, I'm afraid of getting lost again in a street and visiting that limbo again. How are you, listeners? I hope you enjoyed the previous story. Now, let's go with the next. My grandfather experienced this story many years ago. We were recently talking on several visits I made to him, and the subject came up by chance. My grandfather worked for years as a truck driver until he began to age and have age-related problems. Although, before that, he got other jobs before retiring completely a few years ago. Since I was little, my grandfather had financial problems in his family. That's why he took this job when he was old enough to drive, and that put him to carrying merchandise as a truck driver. During his first years of work, he never had any incidents, nor had anything strange happen to him in the first years. It was hard to earn a good salary, and I want you to keep that in mind because, later on, my grandfather will be a very important factor. At that time, I had barely met my grandmother, and they had been dating for a short time. That's why he wanted her to have a little more money when he asked her to marry him so he could organize his wedding and be able to move with her to a house that he owned that day. My grandfather's boss asked him to take some merchandise from Guadalajara to Aguas. It was going to be a long trip, but something that was certain was that it would have better pay than if he delivered merchandise from the same state but to different chains. Obviously, my grandfather did not refuse. It was a very good opportunity to be able to earn a better salary, and he would not always have this type of opportunity. It should be noted that my grandfather and our family are from Guadalajara, so back then, I guess buying a house couldn't have been that difficult or expensive as it is today, and this state is the most expensive. So, he planned the trip, packed his suitcase the same day, said goodbye to his mother as well as my grandmother, started his truck, pulled the trailer, and set off on his route. On the road, maybe you don't know this, but for many years, there have been dangers on the roads of Guadalajara. Well, in fact, in all of Mexico, but I would say especially in this state. Well, there are too many drug dealers, and a cartel is very well known. My grandfather is not afraid. It takes a lot to scare him, and on the contrary, he is the one who has always scared us. But he is not reckless, and has always been careful not to attract the attention of dangerous people, much less for many of his tours. During his tour, everything was going very normal. He still had a day or two to be able to reach his destination, so he was thinking of going to stay in a motel for the night and rest to recover his energy. It had already gotten dark. My grandfather says that, despite the hours he had been driving, he didn't feel that tired, except for the pain in his butt from the hours he had been sitting there. But he didn't want to take a break until he got to a motel to be able to sleep. A few hours, at that moment, he saw, in the distance, a 24-hour motel sign, came, and parked his truck where it wouldn't be in the way. So, he got out of his truck and paid for his stay. That was a quiet night, a calm before the storm that was coming to him. Shortly after dawn came, he left that estancia, loaded his suitcase, and drove his truck again to return to his predestined route. From morning to night, he spent the afternoon listening to the news on the radio, besides the music. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Everything was serene and calm. That was until, little by little, night fell, and we were approaching one of the states that bordered Aguascalientes. My grandfather tells us that suddenly he began to feel as if something or someone was watching him. At first, he thought that it was a car that was following him, but when he turned to look in the rearview mirror, there was no car following him, and he had also passed by several cars before, only that he turned into another route to shorten the distances. In that way, as he continued driving along a lonely road full of leafy foliage and rain, he saw the silhouette of a man with a hat that seemed strange to him. He thought he was hallucinating from lack of sleep and tiredness, so he slowly stopped. The truck got out and approached the man lying under the rain. "Sir, what are you doing here under the rain at this time of night?" my grandfather asked the man, who was still getting wet under the persistent rain. "Ah, I was just walking down the road, but I got lost. Do you think you can give me a ride, and you can take me to the next bus station?" said the man with a deep and calm voice. My grandfather couldn't refuse. He didn't want to leave that man to his fate in the middle of the night, raining and with dangers that surrounded him in every corner. "Of course, hop in and I'll take you to your destination," my grandfather smiled. "Thank you very much." And so the man entered the seat of the co-pilot. The man was wearing an elegant suit. His hair was jet black, his skin somewhat dark. In addition to that, his eyes were ash-colored. Next to him, he was carrying a black leather business briefcase, and it was clear that the man had a good economic position. He wore better clothes than other people, and also showed a lot of confidence in his face and in his words. But the most striking thing were his eyes. It felt like he was looking through your soul. "Hey friend, where are you going?" my grandfather asked that man. "I just want to get to the nearest town. I guess you're in a hurry too, right?" The man returned the question. Well, my grandfather did answer, something like that. "Sir, where were you going at this time of night? Aren't you afraid for your safety? These streets are quite dangerous at this time," my grandfather asked, somewhat intrigued. "Well, if I'm honest, I don't think I fear anything. I'm just afraid of not making a good contract." The man smiled slightly. "Oh, I see you're a businessman, eh?" my grandfather asked again, this time trying to investigate further since that man looked very strange. "Yes, I never let a good contract pass. All people come looking for something specific, and I fulfill their wishes. I give them what they want the most or what will make them the happiest." "Wow, that sounds like an interesting job. Maybe a travel agent or something like that." My grandfather couldn't help but smile. "If so, you must earn quite a salary." It can be said, yes. But the truth is, money does not matter to me. The only thing that matters to me is fulfilling my clients' wishes and sealing good contracts. The man smiled back at my grandfather. "In fact, you have no desires, dreams, that you want to fulfill. Of course, we all have some kind of dream. Although for that, I must work as much as I can while I'm alive." My grandfather answered innocently, not knowing what was going to happen next. "Because today is your lucky day, my friend. What if I told you that whatever you wish, I can make it come true?" That left my grandfather somewhat amazed. It was strange and, at the same time, intriguing. My grandfather looked at him as if it was a joke and asked him, laughing, "Is it a bow or something? So you just tell me what you want, and you'll give it to me. Don't distrust me. I never fail in my dealings," said the man in such a serious manner that my grandfather had to think about his answer. The truth is, I think I want what all people in this life want, to have a lot of money to support my family in a comfortable way, but we all have to work to get it. That's the law of life, friend, I guess. You're right. I can give you those things, dear friend." My grandfather looked at him in disbelief. "You just have to sign here, that's all." My grandfather couldn't believe it. Nothing he said to that man seemed too easy. Now he thought he was some kind of trickster. That is to say, how is it that a gentleman could have whatever he wanted and couldn't have his own car in the middle of that lonely road? My grandfather was sometimes very naive, but he wasn't a fool either, so he wanted to play along. "Hey, sir, a contract is between two parties. Both parties are supposed to give something in return. What do you get in return with all this? The man laughed lightly. You're intelligent and perceptive. Yes, every contract comes with an exchange, but I don't ask for anything monetary. My grandfather could see a certain strange smile on that man. Why was he so eager for me to sign a contract without even having read it? And why was he acting so strange? Hey, but what exactly do you want in return? My grandfather asked again, fearfully, all without taking his eyes off the road. Ah, it's something simple. The man looked fixedly at my grandfather to let him see his ash-colored eyes. All I want is your soul. My grandfather gave a sharp break at that moment. He blinked, and the figure of the man had changed into a more terrifying figure. His skin was burnt, and he also had some horns sticking out of his skull. Now my grandfather knew who it was. When he saw him, he screamed in fear and tried by all means to get out of the truck to run. He started laughing like crazy. You won't be able to escape this, Benjamin. Sooner or later, your soul will be mine, and there will be nothing you can do to prevent it. Once my grandfather unbuckled the seatbelt and opened the door to get out, he realized that the thing had disappeared without leaving a trace. From that moment, my grandfather knew that he was already in the sights of the devil, and that sooner or later he would come back for his soul. How are you, listeners? I hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Now, let's go with the next. What I'm going to tell you is something short. It's a piece of advice that truckers here in Mexico do everything to prevent unforeseen events from occurring. We know that unusual things happen on the roads late at night, and the only thing that accompanies you is the radio on. That's when the strangest thing can happen, really. My colleagues told me all this. They told me that I should always put a pair of pants or a jacket in the passenger seat, because that way I would avoid misunderstandings. At first, I didn't quite understand what they meant. The truth is that the people I've driven with are quite reserved. Well, here, I tell you why. I was on the road in the middle of the night, and I had not followed this advice. At one point, I began to witness a man hitchhiking on the side of the road. This didn't seem strange to me. You can find many people on the road doing the same thing, but this time, I didn't feel like picking anyone up on my truck, so I decided to pass by this person and continue on my way. I didn't misinterpret. On one hand, the company has prohibited us from doing this type of thing, and on the other, it could be quite dangerous as it was too late at night. So, as I said, I simply decided to drive past. After 15 minutes of driving, I saw that there was a man and a woman doing the same thing on the side of the road. The road was too dark. If it weren't for the truck's light, I would not have been able to appreciate that they were really there. They were in the middle of nowhere without lighting or anything. Like I said, I wasn't going to put anyone in my truck at this hour, so, much to my regret for the family, I decided to skip them. You won't believe that after 15 or 20 minutes, I saw another man doing exactly the same thing on the side of the road. This was certainly already very unusual. How was it possible that there were so many people hitchhiking on these roads that practically have no lighting? The truth is that it is something that I found extremely chilling. I didn't want to pay close attention to the matter and continued driving. I put a little music on the radio to distract myself. But a few minutes later, you won't believe it was only a few minutes, I saw another couple ordering a hitchhike. And just 15 meters ahead, an old lady doing the same thing. This was just too weird and even sounded quite creepy. After seeing so many people, I noticed a unique pattern on each of them. Their faces were expressionless. It didn't feel like someone was truly asking for help. They were rather lifeless faces, and they all did exactly the same thing, lifting the thumb and waiting for me to stop. At that moment, I understood what was happening. Those were souls in pain who, in one way or another, had ended up stuck on this road. That's when I finally understood the advice that my companions had given me. At that moment, I took off the jacket I was wearing and put it on the passenger seat, and it worked. I swear that after that, I never saw any other person hitchhiking all over the road, and it's quite an easy trick to understand. If there is something in the passenger seat, it seems that the passenger seat is occupied. At last, all souls left me alone that night, and since I applied this trick, I have not experienced this type of situation again, or I would say, at least not in the same way. That's why I make this recommendation to all new truck drivers, so that they don't go through the same situation that I went through. Be cautious. Remember that there are other beings in this world that we do not understand at all, and we do not know if their intentions are good or bad. So, the best thing we can do is follow the advice of the experienced and learn from the stories of the road, because, in fact, I got off very cheap that day. I know many truckers who didn't come back to tell it. How are you, listeners? I hope you have enjoyed this story. Now, let's go with the next dot. Good evening. My name is Raul. I am originally from El Salvador, and I am dedicated to transporting merchandise, mostly household appliances, from one branch in my city to another. Anyone who knows me knows that I am obsessive about cleanliness. I am very concerned about the cleanliness of the truck, also any possible odors that may be present, both in the cabin and in the transporter box. That's why I had a really bad time when one day I had to work with a very messy classmate. He was really quite dirty. He smoked and left cigarette butts anywhere, even on the seats or on the floor. He also used to leave tissues on the dashboard and things like that. Despite my often warning him to take care of his hygiene, he never listened to me. He was one of those young men who didn't care about anything, not even his job. He usually got into the truck, and after a few minutes, he ended up asleep. His job was to help me with the loading and unloading of the merchandise, and then he would ignore his job while I drove for hours until I reached my destination. This young man really bothered me a lot. I spoke several times with the company managers to change him, but they told me that there was no one else available. The relationship deteriorated little by little. I despised him, and he despised me. I think it all increased when, once, we had to go by my house, and I had forgotten a backpack where I usually keep my belongings for the trip. They are really very small things. A charged thermos with hot water, towels, hygiene items such as deodorants, etc. But for me, they were very important in my daily chores. I had written to my daughter, who was 22 at the time, to be attentive and finally give me the backpack. We arrived at my house, and I honked the horn. After a while, my daughter came out with her backpack in her hand and gave it to me. My daughter is a girl, very pretty. I don't say it only because I am her father, but because she really has a dazzling beauty. She took after her mother, who was also quite attractive. At that moment, I saw my partner Carlos watching her from above down. Everything from his position in the passenger seat bothered me. Much more bothered me that when she left, Carlos threw a whistle and said in a very vulgar tone, "Wow, what a great body your daughter has. Hey, she has huge buttocks," and then he gave a very big, unpleasant smile. Carlos realized that I had been upset with his comment, but far from calming down, he followed him throughout the trip, saying things like he couldn't wait to see her again. And why didn't she invite him to eat at her house one of these days? He even started calling me father-in-law. At that point, I was furious, so I couldn't stand it anymore, and I told him to cut out all that garbage, that my daughter was sacred, and that I wasn't going to let him make fun of her. Carlos looked at me with a smile, and after a pause, he said to me, "But father-in-law, I'm not making fun of her. Simply, I'm saying she has a nice body. Besides, I'm single, and I bet she is too, so nothing's stopping us that we can go out and be happy together." I answered him, very upset, and told him that my daughter would never go out with someone as rude as him. So Carlos widened his smile and whispered, "Well, we'll see later." He remained silent for the rest of the trip. The matter could have ended there, if not. It was a few days later that I saw Carlos near my house. He was walking as if nothing had happened, and that surprised me. When I saw him, I asked him what he was doing there. He looked at me with that always provocative smile, shrugged his shoulders, and said that he wasn't doing anything, that he had the freedom to walk wherever he wanted. I let him pass, even though this made me. I had put on alert. 2 days later, I had to go pick up my daughter from the university. She went out very late at night, and I didn't like that she came back alone on public transport. So I went to pick her up. I was very surprised when I saw Carlos also in the university parking lot, riding his old motorcycle. He looked at me and smiled at me again in that way that I disliked. He raised his hand, greeting me, and said, "Hello, father-in-law. How are you doing?" I asked. I got out of the car and approached him. "Hey, I told you not to call me for. My daughter would never look at a daddy like you." Carlos threw a smile and didn't answer me anything. I asked him what he was doing there, and he told me that he was in that place because he really liked watching young people leaving the university. I found his comment repulsive, so I asked him if he was okay with him being there bothering the young people who were only going to study there. "Oh man, you think that young girls only come here to study. You don't know anything about them. Young people come here to have fun and get boyfriends." After that, Carlos patted me on the back as if consoling me. I moved away and warned him not to touch me again. Carlos raised both hands, feigning innocence. Just at that moment, my daughter came out of the university, and you won't believe the first thing she did. I saw her running towards me. I thought that maybe she was excited about something and was coming to greet me, so I was prepared to greet her with a strong hug, but who she hugged was not me. Hey, daughter, what are you doing? I came to get you. Why are you hugging that animal?" My daughter turned round and looked surprised to see me. She had not noticed me in the least. She told me that I should excuse her because Carlos had written to her a few minutes ago and said that he was going to pick her up. I was surprised, so I asked her how the hell she met this guy, and she told me that a few days ago she had car problems, and Carlos was just passing by and he helped her. Apparently, he was quite nice to her, so from there they started talking, and by chance, she found out that Carlos was my co-worker. She said she hadn't told me anything yet because the truth is that they were just dating, and she was a little embarrassed to go out with my co-worker. However, she said she was thinking of telling me this weekend. I was boiling with anger. "But daughter, you don't know Carlos well enough. This man is a disgusting man who doesn't care about anything. He only thinks about himself and is a womanizer. I don't approve of this relationship, absolutely." I told my daughter in a rather harsh way, and she obviously got offended a lot and said some pretty ugly things to me. She told me that Carlos was a gentleman and that I should stop worrying about her because she was already an adult and didn't need her father watching her as if she were a child. All those words hurt more than she could have imagined, If you're a parent, maybe you understand a little. We only want the best for our children, and despite that, sometimes we can be quite overprotective. This was not the case. I was actually saving her from dating a real animal. And so, before I could answer her, she got on Carlos's motorcycle, and they both disappeared in the middle of the road. The next day, when I went to the company, Carlos was waiting for me. He didn't tell me anything. I could only see a triumphant laugh on his face, and I had to swallow down the anger of seeing that smile. Like that, I got on the truck and said I hadn't met this guy. Never in my life did the relationship between Carlos and my daughter extend over time. She seemed very happy, and seeing that she was happy, well, I little by little started to relax. I knew that Carlos was useless at work and was a truly unpleasant person, but maybe in this relationship he was doing things right. So maybe Carlos wasn't as bad a guy as I had thought. And as for our working relationship, I hate to admit it, but little by little, Carlos started to listen to me regarding the cleaning. He started to help me more with the truck and even offered to drive it a few times so that I could rest a little. So the next 5 months passed, and I was already resigned to having Carlos as my son-in-law. I still didn't like him very much, but at least it was clear that he was trying to please my daughter, and that's all I cared about, or at least that's what it looked like. One night I was awake, so I got up to have a glass of water. Passing through my daughter's room, I heard her crying. I approached the door discreetly to listen better, and there I heard her speaking with someone. I couldn't hear everything very clearly, but in a certain moment, I heard the words, "Why are you doing this to me?" followed by the name of Carlos. At that moment, I opened the door with a push. My daughter was on the bed, crying with the cell phone glued to her ear. When she saw me, she seemed to get very scared and hung up the communication, hiding the phone under the pillow. I asked my daughter what was happening, but she didn't want to tell me anything. There it was that I asked her if it was Carlos who had done this to her. If that was so, I swore to her that I would kill that guy when I saw him, but she insisted that it was nothing, that I wouldn't get into her matters, much less in her love life. Then she told me to get out of her room and close the door in front of me. I obeyed, but I felt too furious. For having had Carlos in that moment, I would have beaten him up. The next day, I questioned him. He smiled in that characteristic way that he always does, and then continued chatting on his cell phone. For a few days after, I noticed my daughter was very deteriorated. She barely ate, she had bags under her eyes, and she looked quite weak. I asked her what was happening, but she didn't tell me anything. She said she just felt bad because of something she had eaten, but I knew it wasn't like that. It was because of Carlos. Something was happening between them that had my daughter in that state. Several weeks passed, and one day my daughter suddenly told me that she was going to drop out of college. I was very surprised because she loved her career. When I asked her the reasons, she told me that she was bored and that she was just planning to study something else. At that moment, I took her by the shoulders and told her, "Daughter, I know all this is because of Carlos. Something is happening between you guys, and I need you to tell me. You have to leave that guy. You were a happy girl full of dreams and projects. Now you spend your time sleeping, you don't want to go to university anymore, and you even dropped out of going to the gym. It's obvious that Carlos is hurting you." I shouldn't have said that. My daughter became furious and forbade me from mentioning Carlos again, and threatened that the next time I got involved in her business, she would take her things and leave the house. There I knew I had to act immediately. My daughter was in poor health. She had a very irritable character, and I almost didn't recognize her anymore. I had to go around with care. It was obvious that Carlos exerted a great influence over her, even superior to mine, so it was easy for him to turn her against me. I didn't want to lose my daughter. I just wanted that beast to go away. So I started to investigate Carlos's private life. I started following him after work and was constantly monitoring all of his social media. So I wasn't too surprised to learn that he was dating at least 2 women at the same time. One of them even had a child who saw him 2 or 3 times a month. Carlos's home was a copy of his way of life. Messy, dirty, with the facade full of humidity and mold, and the grass high and careless. I decided to ask some neighbors about the kind of life Carlos led, but no one wanted to tell me anything. However, there was a very kind old lady who warned me that Carlos belonged to a family where everyone practiced witchcraft. I told her the case of my daughter, and the old lady nodded. She told me that my daughter had not been the only victim of that type, since she knew several cases of women who had been through the same thing. Carlos tied them up, and that was the only way that someone could notice a being as unpleasant as him. At that moment, I was worried, but the truth is, none of these discoveries surprised me. I asked the old lady if there was anything she could do about it, and the old lady told me that her sister was doing spiritual house cleaning and that maybe she could help me, although she warned me that the cost would be quite high. I told her that I didn't care about the cost. I was willing to pay whatever the amount was to save my daughter. The old lady threw a smile and then told me something I didn't expect. She said the witchcraft that Carlos and his family practiced was quite powerful, and it was very likely that the sister of that old lady was going to ask me for something to carry out the counterspell, because otherwise it wouldn't work. I hadn't understood her words very well. However, I thanked her and begged her to put me in touch with her sister. The next day, I got an appointment with her. She was an old woman, not as kind as her sister, with a strong but sincere character. She listened to my case attentively, then repeated what her sister had said, that this was a very powerful family of witches, and that the only way to counter them was to sacrifice something very precious to me. I didn't know what to answer. There was nothing more precious than my daughter, but it was obvious I couldn't give my daughter to do a counterspell. That wouldn't make any sense. The old woman saw through my concern and said not to worry, that I could not give my daughter for the counterspell, but there was something pretty valuable that I could give her, and it was a part of my life. I was not sure how a part of my life could even be possible. She explained to me that I shouldn't worry, that it was going to be an insignificant part of my life, only it would take 5 years of my life. If I'm honest, I was pretty scared when I heard that number. 5 years. 5 years. Many things can be done in 5 years. It was certainly too long, and I didn't know how much time I had left in life. I was not such an old man, but I was not very young either. Let's say, without hesitation, I didn't think about it for long, so I told her that I accepted. I told her that I would do anything to save my daughter. The old lady looked me up and down and then told me that I was excellent, that not many people were willing to make a decision so quickly. Unfortunately, I can't tell you much about the ritual because the first thing that old lady warned was that this could not be made public knowledge, that everything that happened here should stay between us. I can only say that everything was really quite strange. After that ritual, I felt quite different, more tired, more sore, and when I saw my face in the mirror, I saw myself undoubtedly older, and at that moment I realized that those old woman's words were not a simple lie. I asked her if that was everything, and she answered me that yes, from now on, my daughter was going to see Carlos as he really was, a repulsive being. she would surely try to stop him. He would become violent, but his restraint would have no effect, and my daughter would move away from him, and I would never see him again. The old lady's words came true just as she had told me. My daughter said she stopped seeing Carlos 2 days later. I heard the whole discussion by phone, and the next day at work, Carlos was like he looked crazy and furious. When I got into the truck, he looked at me with hatred and asked what the hell I had done. I did what any father would do for his daughter: keep her away from an animal like you. Since that day, I never saw Carlos again in the job since Carlos was fired the next day, apparently for having stolen company belongings. Carlos swore revenge on everyone, but a few days later, I found out that he had fallen seriously sick, so he went with his family to another state. I think the spell of the old lady not only worked to save my daughter. I read somewhere that giving years of life is something very powerful and produces very difficult witchcraft to counteract, as well as granting a protective power to whoever made the sacrifice, all equivalent to the years of life spent. Well, whatever it is, today I live in quiet age with my daughter. She resumed her career and feels quite happy to have gotten rid of that blockhead in time. Also, at that moment, she thanked me for everything I had done. She told me that I had always been right and that I should forgive her for having acted like that all this time. From now on, she was going to listen to my advice more, and I hoped that the next partner that she had my approval. I felt too happy that I even cried, and we melted our beautiful reconciliation into a strong and beautiful hug. I don't care if I lose 5, 10, or 20 years of life. With all this, it is something that I will never regret because the happiness and well-being of my daughter is all that has ever been important. How are you, listeners? I hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Now with the next story. Hello, good evening to the entire community. My name is Ramiro. I am 32 years old, and I have been a truck driver for about 8 or 9 years now. I work for a company which offers a wide range of services, one of which is messaging. Generally, I don't take trips that mean too much distance. For me, since I am an overweight man, and that could be a little harmful to my health. Well, actually, no. These are simply my excuses for not taking long trips, which always end up being assigned to my colleagues. And although from time to time they assign me a trip outside the city, it is always those nearby cities that wouldn't even take 3 hours to get to. The story I want to tell you happened on one of those fortuitous occasions when I had to travel. I live and work in the city of Cali in Colombia, and I had to carry a load to the city of Palmyra. If I traveled fast enough, I could get that trip to take less than 2 hours, so I couldn't complain about it anyway. Even if for some reason it took longer, it wasn't going to bother me at all because that stretch of road is the best there is to make a trip. It is normally known as the straight line to Palmyra due to its name. It indicates that it is literally a straight line. It has no curves and is quite spacious. It is in excellent condition, and on both sides there are some beautiful valleys. The only bad thing about this trip was that it was supposed to be done at night. This person who asked for this order needed some kind of move, was moving his business, and needed to take all his things. To me, it seemed really strange that the guy could only receive his things at night. I mean, it's supposed to be he has a fast food restaurant, so he shouldn't have everything ready during the day so he can sell at night. For me, this was something really strange and out of place. In the end, my duty was not to question my client's decisions or anything like that. They simply paid my company to carry some things, and the company paid me to do it that way. Without questioning myself too much, I set off at around 9 p.m. I drove until I got to the toll, and while I was paying, the girl there said something to me which took me a while to process. She told me to be careful and that, if possible, drive as fast as I could, since recently some people had reported being victims of vandalism on the road. This seemed strange to me, to say the least, because such a scandalous situation, even if it did not appear on the national news, should at least appear on the regional news, but not even in the most sensationalist newspapers had I seen even a similar news. I decided to ignore the girl and pass the toll, and I continued driving calmly as I had been doing until then. While driving, I think I could see something in motion. There were simply faults with not very high grass on both sides of the road. So if there was something moving, a silhouette or something like that, I could notice if I looked closely enough. However, I was driving, so I could barely occasionally sneak glances to the sides or use my peripheral vision. I thought it was my imagination, so I carried on with my business until I suddenly heard a loud bang in the roof of my truck. It sounded like a pretty loud bang, and I obviously got upset a little, or should I say a lot, since even a small scream had escaped me. And when I took a small look at the ceiling, I realized that I had a really noticeable dent, and I could clearly see that there was a huge stone there. Obviously, the dent made sense with such a stone, but what didn't make sense was the precision with which it had to be launched to make it stay there. In addition to how heavy it was, that it was miraculous, and fortunately the stone did not go through the ceiling. Or it could have been in serious trouble, because the point where it had fallen was exactly off the top of my head. I know it was really dangerous, but luckily it wasn't anything serious. When I finished downloading everything, I set off to return. When I went through the toll, everyone looked at that dent strangely, but no one said anything to me. Finally, when they enabled the passage for me to leave, I accelerated at full speed because I was not going to allow something like that to happen to me again. The speed I was going had me quite confident, but apparently it was not enough because suddenly I heard the passenger window glass breaking. It was so sudden that by reflex I ended up covering myself. The stone hit right in the place where I was covering myself with my hands. I was about to lose control of the truck, but fortunately it's not like those heavy-duty trucks, so it was much easier to handle, which made it possible for me to regain control of the situation. My heart was beating 1,000 miles an hour, but this was not over because I could clearly hear how many stones hit the truck. Fortunately, none of them came back through the window, but it was quite nerve-wracking. I don't know how long this continued, but I did everything I could to accelerate fully until finally the impact stopped. After that, I didn't let my guard down until I got to Collie, and there I looked for the police nearest. Just before I got off to make the respective complaint, I noticed something strange on the stone that was about to hit my head before. It had something white stuck to it. It was a piece of paper. I decided to read it, and without a doubt, what I saw gave me chills. You're next. I have no idea what it referred to as to why I told all this to the police. Absolutely everything, because I was not the only case. The police have been investigating, but unfortunately, they haven't been able to find anything, and I live every day with fear, remembering those words of which I knew nothing about their meaning. How are you, listeners? Well, let's go with a new story of this night. As we all know, if we care to find meaning in absolutely everything that happens to us, we can never be truly happy. It's something I learned over the years, and I know from my own experience that it applies to absolutely any area of our lives. However, after that time, I understood that it is not enough just with that, but also it is healthy that some things do not happen to us. I have lived too long, and I am sure not all people are prepared to face certain types of situations or challenges like me. I was not prepared to go through such horror, which was about to make my heart stop. Good night to all the community. I hope you are well and enjoying your lives. My name is Michael. I'm 62 years old, and I've been a truck driver for over 30 years. Something I loved from the first time I got on a truck. I'm not a man too sentimental, but I can say that I am really grateful for this profession. Well, when I was literally broke, I started dedicating myself to this, which saved me from all the financial trouble I got into. I was a young man who was too stupid to manage my money correctly. Of course, that changed when my wife came into my life, but I've still had many experiences within this profession that have helped me grow as a person. And there have been some others, like the ones I'm going to tell you, that have undoubtedly made me doubt whether to continue to dedicate myself to this. I guess I should first put them in a little bit of context. I am mainly dedicated to transporting food from the suppliers' locations to the warehouses of the stores that there are in my country, Colombia. Although they are not necessarily all chain stores, I will not say the names since I am a little afraid of all those advertising issues. But I can say that I worked for the main cities I traveled to, generally located in the coffee axis in the departments of Quindio and Risaralda. For those who have not had the opportunity to visit these places, I really recommend them. I am originally from Bogotá, the capital of Colombia, but when I started working in this region, I really fell in love with everything, apart from all this. It is the coffee producing area, and I am a coffee addict. So seeing these plantations up close and how coffee was produced was something wonderful. Anyway, now that you have a little context, I think I can continue with the story. I had just finished a delivery to one of the warehouses in Armenia, and I had to head towards Circassia, one of my favorite places in Quindio. It had been a really calm day, and although it was a little cold, it was still a very nice day. Usually, the only thing I do is drive. My companion is simply there in case I fall asleep, and the one who does the loading or unloading process is directly the suppliers or warehouse employees. So I can't really complain when my job is just driving. I don't remember which section of the Armenis-Carcia road we were on, but I remember very clearly that it was 9 o'clock at night, and at that moment, very suddenly, the truck's engine started making strange noises. It was like if there had been a revolution other times, as if it were drowning. I looked at my partner somewhat incredulously, and he looked back at me with the same expression. This truck was one of the company's new acquisitions for the one I work in, and although it was actually about 2 years old, we always had it in perfect condition. My partner and I first let the engine cool down a bit, and then we started to check. However, the strange thing was that everything seemed perfectly fine. My partner wanted me to leave immediately, but if the engine had made those noises, it was because something strange was happening, so I insisted that we stay until we knew what was going on. I know a couple of things about mechanics, so I took a few tools that I always carry with me, and there we started to review even more thoroughly. I think it took almost half an hour, maybe a little more, but finally we managed to find the problem. There were cockroaches inside some parts of the engine, and believe me when I tell you that there were not only some, there were too many, and some of them were even alive. The guy I always have as a companion has become disgusted and afraid of insects. So even though he is a perfectly healthy young man of 36 years old, I had to start cleaning the engine myself, a 62-year-old man. about to retire. I know it sounds a little indignant, but well, the truth is that I was, and a lot, but anyway, there was no other choice. I had to do it, but it was really strange how the hell there were so many insects inside the engine of my truck. It actually looked more like someone had put those cockroaches in there on purpose, because otherwise, I couldn't explain to myself how the hell they got there. I would say that it took me approximately an hour and a half for the whole process, and it was a somewhat challenging task, specifically when I started to feel that many of those cockroaches were climbing by the arm, my ankle. Somehow I managed it, and the engine came back to life. Having done this, we were able to resume our journey. We continued relatively calmly, although a little slowly. Well, I was worried that there were more insects inside the engine that I had not been able to see. This relative normality continued until suddenly, I don't know how to explain it, but I felt the truck was a bit strange. It was as if it was having trouble moving forward, and from one moment to the next, I felt that it stopped abruptly. The last thing I remember from that moment on, I hit my forehead with the steering wheel and became unconscious. I immediately woke up lying on the ground next to my truck in a place that I didn't even know. My partner was, well, not really. He was simply gone. My forehead hurt a lot, and I could feel that it was terribly swollen and in pain. Headaches of those in which you feel your head throbbing with a sensation that I really don't wish on anyone. At that moment, I started to shout my partner's name. He didn't appear. I just couldn't see anywhere, and I had already started to worry. Suddenly, I heard that in the back, someone gave a weak scream. I quickly headed towards that place, and I realized that it was my partner who was being gagged by a couple of guys wearing some rather strange masks. I think they had the shape of a fox or something like that. They were surprised when they saw me, and they put us on alert. "Look, we have nothing. Please let him go. We have a shipment inside the truck. Take all you want, but please leave us alone." The guys didn't say anything and started heading towards me. They smelled really bad, like rotten meat. I know it really is disgusting, but what was really remarkable were their hands. They looked much older than mine, were long, so thin that they looked like their skin was stuck to their bones, and their nails were really horrible and long. I don't know why, but at the time, I was sure that they hadn't come only to rob us, so my first reaction to this was to run. I know it sounds really cruel to leave my partner there, to go out running, but one of the two should be able to leave to look for help, right? To be honest, maybe it's just me justifying my cowardice at that moment. I was too scared, and I didn't know what else I could do, so I ran as fast as my legs allowed me to do. Everything regardless of the pain in my head or my front. I don't know how many years I hadn't run, and I was really surprised by how fast I did it, but the guys were also running behind me, and they were really quick. To say that what characterizes us as older people is that, despite that we don't have the energy of the young, we are wiser and more cunning. I knew that those guys were fast. I was never going to be able to escape with normal methods. So I got into the trees and vegetation and went as far as I could. I don't know how long I spent there running away, but I made sure I kept running away until suddenly I heard someone knock on the door. My truck's horn honked. I quickly headed there, and when I got to the truck, I was filled with satisfaction to see exactly what I imagined had happened. My partner had somehow managed to free himself and get to the truck. He started it and called me using the horn. I hurriedly got in, and my partner tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn on. We tried several times, but nothing happened. He got desperate and started to hit the board. The situation was quite desperate. Finally, somehow, we managed to start the engine, but at the same time, my pursuers had returned, and they were in front of the truck. Whether everything that I did was morally accepted or not, all I wanted was to get out of there. So I immediately shouted to my friend to rock them and get us out of here. It seems my partner had the same thought as me, and he pressed the accelerator to the floor. He didn't care about the small noise that we heard when we ran over them. Yes, I know some of you may question ourselves, but who among you would have made another decision at that moment? While my partner was driving, I felt as if my heart was going to really explode. The ant moved very quickly and had a sharp, stabbing pain in the chest. We didn't know where we were going because neither of us knew that stretch of road, but somehow we took some detours, and we finally ended up in Pereira, which was clearly not the city we were heading to, but at least it was a city, and we could go to the hospital, where I discovered that my partner had a deep wound in his abdomen. But even stranger was when I asked him how he had done it. He told me that it had been one of those guys using his weird hands. On my part, I was about to suffer a heart attack, but now we are both fine. The way in which we ended up in that weird situation was really confusing, but I'm glad that we were able to get away with it and that something more serious didn't happen. I have no intentions of knowing what the hell happened or who those guys were. The only thing that I want is to erase that terrifying moment from my mind and be able to travel to Circassia again without feeling afraid or without trembling all over the body remembering what happened. How are you, listeners? I hope you have enjoyed the previous story. Well, let's go with the next. Sometimes you tend to trust people who don't really deserve your trust. It doesn't sound sad at all and a little cruel, I know, but that's the truth. There really is nothing more to say about it. We spend our lives distrusting everyone around us, but ironically, the person we trusted the most ends up betraying us. Because I brought out this painful theme to light, well, the truth is that it is very related to the story that I came to tell you today. The story of a really distrustful guy, a guy who ended up trusting someone who betrayed him in the worst way. Nice to meet you all. My name is Darwin. Good evening to all members of this community. The stories you tell have helped me in ways I can't explain, but I really didn't come here to tell you that. I've been a truck driver for 16 years, and now I am 45, and I wanted to tell this story as a way to vent my feelings of frustration. I already told you that I was betrayed, but I never imagined it would be that way. Right now, I don't even know what to feel about it. It all started the day I took my best friend to my house for lunch. We had both known each other for a few years, and we started a friendship of those that you only get to have a couple of times in your life. He was practically like my brother. I guess because I didn't realize everything that day, but I was too blind. When he came to my home with his family, I think I should clarify that he was a married man like me. My wife stayed watching him for a moment, surprised, and asked me a little stupefied, "He is your friend?" In that moment, I didn't give too much importance to that reaction, and neither to the fact that my friend also reacted in a way a bit strange. Anyway, the food was finished, my friend went home, and everything was normal until that moment. The next day, I had to take a somewhat tiring trip from Sydney to Melbourne. Right, I think I forgot to mention that I'm originally from Venezuela, and I ended up in Australia after I fell in love and ended up getting married and starting a family here. Well, like I told you, I had this trip that although I could have done it in one day, I decided to do it in two so I could ensure that the cargo I was carrying arrived in the best possible condition. For various reasons, I cannot say what I had in my truck, only that it was something a bit delicate. That day, I spent it with pain, headache, and dizziness, and when night came, despite how tired I was, I just wanted to keep driving. It is something totally strange for someone who values their rest time so much as I do. I still had to eat something, so I stopped at the first place I saw that they served food. There, a somewhat older waitress served me, but she looked at me in a really strange way, like I had something strange on my face or something. They took a little while to serve me the food, but it finally arrived, and strangely enough, the waitress left the food there and sat in front of me just to look at me. I obviously felt quite uncomfortable, but the food was already there, so I just started eating, and she suddenly asked me how I felt. It was at that moment that, since I started eating, the headache had disappeared. I simply told her that it seemed that her food cured diseases, so I continued eating at ease. But she immediately interrupted and told me something I will never forget. You have the mark of death. If you continue on your path, you will die. This was something too strange and terrifying, and I could only remain silent with a somewhat curious look. Maybe she was trying to play some kind of joke on me. But the next thing she said to me was that those kinds of marks only came in pairs. And if I didn't find out who had the other mark, we could both die. I started laughing, but after that, she told me that when a person had been marked in this way, he would suffer from extreme headaches, dizziness, and he would feel desires to continue wearing out no matter how tired he was. I am not an expert in matters of the occult, but without a doubt, the woman had pointed out all the ailments I had had during the day. At that moment, I was already interested enough to know more, because the woman had really been convincing. I don't know why she did it, but she told me that she was only missing one time to close the restaurant, and that if I stayed, she could tell me who had made that mark, for what reason, and who else had been marked. I think I had come to my senses enough to want a break, so I asked her if she had a nice place for me to sleep. It was a deal, and she agreed without many objections. When the time came, the truth came. We were, the two of us alone, in the restaurant. It was already 11 o'clock at night. The woman arrived with a bunch of strange artifacts that made me think that she was a Santera or something like that. Suddenly, she took a needle, then held my hand, pricked my finger, and ran the needle over my tongue. Everything was so fast that I couldn't even react, but she closed her eyes and seemed to enter some kind of strange trance, and the table inexplicably started to shake. I was quite surprised when the woman opened her eyes. They were completely black, and she said in a voice you would never think could be hers, that someone I trusted a lot wanted something that I appreciated very much, and had given me that mark the last time we saw each other. I don't know why, but at that moment, the only person I could think of was Patrick, my best friend, but it made no sense whatsoever that this was happening. The woman immediately made me remember that the night before, when Patrick came to eat at our house, he had brought me a sweet that he wanted me to try. Immediately, I threw up. I know it's something really inexplicable, but that's how it was, and, incredibly, among the vomit, I saw that something started to move. It wasn't something very big. It was more like a worm, but the fact is that there was something between my vomit. After this, the woman told me that the other person who had been marked was Patrick's wife. Obviously, she didn't tell me directly, but she did give me enough clues to know it was her. After saying all this, the woman came out of that strange trance, And now, with her normal voice and her completely normal eyes, she told me that I should return as quickly as possible to my house. She didn't give me a why, since she didn't really know, but she told me if I managed to return home before nightfall the next day, I could see the whole truth. Somehow, this woman had been convincing enough to make me believe in everything she said, and the food she had given me before had given me a lot of energy. So I immediately thanked the woman and got in my truck. Obviously, I tried to give her some money as a token of gratitude, but she didn't accept it. So I continued my trip. My idea was to finish my trip to Melbourne since I was halfway there. I slept 1 or 2 hours, and I came back at full speed. By the way, the woman told me that the food that she had given me would give me enough energy to not need to sleep until the next day. And I didn't believe it until I made the delivery in Melbourne and realized that her words were true. So I finished driving back home almost immediately after making the delivery. I don't know why I drove so fast. I even got a couple of tickets, but there was an assumption in my mind that I didn't want to be made reality. I still had to confirm it with my own eyes, and I didn't care at all about the infractions. I just wanted to get home before dark. Somehow, I managed it, and despite all the problems that came my way on the way, I arrived home at about 4:30 in the afternoon after leaving the truck in the company parking lot. I even felt a little proud that it had been a new record. When I got home, I was as quiet as possible and then went straight to my room, only to confirm the terrifying truth that I didn't want to believe, my best friend in my bed with my wife. I think I don't need to describe to you how I felt at that moment. The worst of all was that when I managed to pressure them enough to find out the truth, it turned out that both had agreed to do witchcraft on us. Both my wife and Patrick's wife were the ones who put the grave as a mark of death. I think it goes without saying that I got divorced, and I don't keep in touch with any of them. But the feeling of betrayal that left me with is something that I have not been able to recover from until today.